Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. I grew up in a small town called Maple Creek. It wasn't much, just a few streets, a couple of stores, and the kind of quiet you only find in places where everyone knows everyone else. It was peaceful, or at least it seemed that way at first. But when the first death happened, everything changed. It was a cold morning in early October when I first heard about it. My best friend, Lily, was the one who told me. We were sitting on the old swings at the park, the metal chains creaking as we pushed ourselves back and forth. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the early fog still clung to the trees like ghosts. "Did you hear about Mr. Dawson?" Lily asked, her voice low. I shook my head, puzzled. Mr. Dawson had lived in Maple Creek for as long as I could remember. He owned the small hardware store on Main Street and was one of the town's few elderly residents. His shop smelled of wood and metal, and he always had a smile for everyone. But now, it seemed, something had happened to him. "No," I replied, trying to focus on Lily's face in the dim light. He died last night." Lily whispered it as if saying it out loud would make it too real. I stared at her, unsure of what to say. Death wasn't something we ever talked about in Maple Creek. It was the kind of place where everyone lived to be old, where people passed away peacefully in their sleep. No one was ever prepared for a sudden death, especially not in the way Mr. Dawson's death had come. "They say it was a heart attack," Lily continued, glancing around nervously as if someone might be listening. "But I don't know. It doesn't feel right. I heard from my mom that he didn't even seem sick." I couldn't shake the feeling that Lily was right. Something about it didn't sit well with me. Mr. Dawson had always been the picture of health, and his passing, so sudden and unexplained, seemed wrong. That night, my parents were talking about it over dinner. My mom and dad were both quiet, glancing at each other as if they knew something they weren't saying. After a few minutes, my dad spoke up. "There's been a few strange things happening around town recently," he said, his voice low. "Unexplained deaths, missing pets, people talking about strange shadows in the woods. It's all a bit unsettling." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by strange?" Dad hesitated. "I'm not sure. Just a feeling. There's a tension in the air these days. People are nervous, like something is about to happen." The next few days were filled with rumors. People whispered about Mr. Dawson's death everywhere I went. At the grocery store, at school, even on the streets. Some said it was natural causes, while others believed there was something darker at play. But no one could explain what had happened. Then, a week later, it happened again. This time, it was Mrs. Jenkins, the school librarian. She'd been working at the library for years and had always been a kind and quiet woman. She never hurt anyone. But just like Mr. Dawson, she was found dead in her home, her body lying in a way that made it look like she had simply collapsed. I couldn't stop thinking about it. 2 people in a week? That was way too much for a town like ours. And what was worse, there were no clear answers. The police didn't find any signs of foul play, no indications that anything unusual had happened. It was like they had just disappeared. It wasn't until the 3rd death that I started to understand what was going on. This time, it was Mr. Granger, the town's mechanic. He lived on the outskirts of town, near the old forest that everyone avoided after dark. The forest had always been a little eerie, but nobody ever thought it was dangerous. Mr. Granger's death was different, though. He was found at the edge of the forest, his body covered in strange markings, like scratches that couldn't have come from a wild animal. And there was something else, something even more disturbing. The forest, which had always been thick with trees, was suddenly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no movement. It was as if the entire place had been frozen in time. I started to wonder if these deaths were connected somehow. Each one seemed to happen after someone ventured near the woods. It wasn't long before the rumors spread that something in the forest was killing people. But what? One evening, I decided to find out. I couldn't sit around waiting for another death to happen. I gathered my courage, grabbed a flashlight, and headed for the woods. My heart pounded as I stepped into the thick trees. The air was heavy, and the silence was almost suffocating. As I walked deeper into the forest, I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my breath came in shallow bursts. I knew I shouldn't be there, but I couldn't stop now. I reached the spot where Mr. Granger's body had been found. The ground was disturbed, as if someone had been digging, but there were no signs of his body, just a hole, deep and dark. I shone my flashlight into it, but all I saw were shadows. Shadows that seemed to move and shift, even though there was no wind. I took a step back, my heart racing. That's when I heard it, a low, almost inaudible whisper coming from the trees. "Leave." I froze, my body stiff with fear. It was the voice of someone who had been lost, someone who didn't want to be found. The whisper grew louder, as if calling me closer, urging me to follow it into the darkness. But I didn't. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my feet pounding the earth as I heard the voice following me, growing more frantic. "Leave," it kept repeating over and over, until I couldn't hear it anymore. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed up, staring out the window, watching the dark trees in the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. In the days that followed, the town seemed to change. People were more afraid than ever. The deaths had left a shadow over everything, and the whispers continued. I heard them every time I went outside, growing louder with each passing day. The police couldn't find answers. The town was filled with fear, and no one knew what to do. Some said the deaths were the work of a curse. Others thought it was a killer hiding in the woods. But the truth, I believe, was something far darker, something ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to rise again. I still live in Maple Creek, but I don't walk near the woods anymore. I don't even go near the edge of town. Every time I hear a rustle in the trees or feel that chill in the air, I remember the whispers, and I wonder, how many more deaths will there be before the town learns that some things in the dark are never meant to be understood? And that's when I realized the true terror wasn't in the deaths. It was in what was waiting for us, just out of sight, in the heart of the forest. My name is Sam, and I was born and raised in a small town called Maple Ridge. You've probably never heard of it. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the most exciting thing that happens is a new family moving in or an occasional town fair. It's quiet, peaceful, too peaceful, maybe. But that's all changed now, and it all started with the strange deaths. It was the middle of summer, the heat thick in the air. Maple Ridge was baking under the sun, with no breeze to offer any relief. It was one of those summer days when you can feel the weight of the world pressing down on you, but the town just carries on like nothing's wrong. It wasn't unusual for people to gather outside their porches, or for kids to ride bikes down the empty roads. There wasn't much to worry about, or at least that's what we thought. The first death wasn't anything too strange, or so it seemed at first. It was old Mr. Holloway. He was in his late 80s, a widower with no family left in town. He lived alone in a house at the edge of Maple Ridge, surrounded by tall trees and a small garden that he spent most of his days tending to. He wasn't someone I saw often, but I knew him by sight. Everyone did. One morning, Mr. Holloway was found dead in his home, slumped over his kitchen table, a cold cup of tea beside him. The cause of death was ruled as a stroke, and that was the end of it. Or at least, that's what the doctors said. No one thought much of it at the time. Old age, health issues, nothing unusual. But I was wrong. A few days after Mr. Holloway passed, people began to talk. It started with whispers, then became louder as more and more folks began to notice something strange. There was an oddness to the air, a kind of heaviness that seemed to hang over the town. It was like something had changed, and no one could put their finger on what it was. Then, the second death occurred. It was Mrs. Lancaster, the schoolteacher who had been teaching in Maple Ridge for decades. She was a kind woman, always cheerful and with a smile for everyone. She had never been sick, at least not that anyone knew of. But one afternoon, after leaving the library, she collapsed on the sidewalk in front of the post office. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was dead. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but just like with Mr. Holloway, there was something off about it. Mrs. Lancaster had been in perfect health, or so it seemed. No one understood why it happened. At this point, People were starting to get nervous. The town's mood shifted from confusion to fear. The deaths were too close together, too sudden, too strange. And the worst part? There didn't seem to be any clear reason for them. Then, the third death occurred, and that's when things started to get really unsettling. It was on a Friday evening when the third body was found. It was a young man named Danny, someone I had grown up with. He was only 22, full of life, always smiling and joking around. He worked at the local diner, and anyone who had ever been there knew him. Danny was known for being a little reckless, always doing things on a dare, but no one ever thought of him as someone who would just suddenly drop dead. But that's exactly what happened. Danny had been out with friends that night, enjoying the warmth of the summer evening, when he suddenly went into a violent seizure. His friends tried to help him, but by the time the paramedics arrived, he was already gone. The doctors said it was a sudden, severe allergic reaction to something, but Danny had never had any allergies. And besides, the doctors couldn't figure out what had caused it. At this point, the town was on edge. 3 deaths in such a short period of time? It was too much. Something didn't feel right, and everyone could sense it. The local police tried to reassure everyone. They said the deaths were just coincidences, a series of unfortunate events. But deep down, even they knew something wasn't adding up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the town felt heavier with each passing day. There was a growing sense of dread that I couldn't explain, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. Then, the 4th death happened. This time, it was the sheriff, Deputy Harris. Now, Harris wasn't a man who scared easily. He had been a cop for years, seen everything from minor thefts to violent crimes. He was the kind of man who didn't believe in superstitions or anything that went bump in the night. But when they found him, it was different. Deputy Harris had been walking his usual route around town late one evening when he simply vanished. No one had seen him leave, and no one had heard a thing. The next morning, his body was discovered in the woods, just outside of town. His face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror. What was worse, the sheriff's uniform he had been wearing was torn and shredded, as if something had attacked him. There were deep gouges on his arms, like claw marks. No animal in Maple Ridge had claws like that. The town was in a panic. For deaths, each more bizarre than the last. People were talking about curses, about something evil lurking in the woods surrounding the town. Everyone began to stay inside after dark, and the once peaceful streets of Maple Ridge became eerily quiet. But it wasn't just the deaths that were unsettling. It was the way people started to change. People who had been friendly before started to act paranoid. They would look over their shoulders when they walked down the street. They whispered to each other in hushed tones, afraid to speak too loudly. There was a growing sense of paranoia, as if everyone in town knew something they weren't telling. One evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't sit around waiting for something else to happen. I had to find out what was going on. I went to the town's library, the place where all the old records were kept. I knew I had to dig through them to find anything that might explain the strange deaths. The librarian, Mrs. Foster, gave me a curious look but didn't say anything as I began going through the dusty shelves. Hours passed as I sifted through old files and papers, but nothing seemed to stand out until I came across a folder labeled The Legend of Maple Ridge. Inside, there was a story, passed down through generations, about a curse that haunted the town. It was said to have been placed by an ancient spirit, a being that had once lived in the forest that surrounded the town. According to the legend, the spirit would wake every so many years, claiming the lives of a few chosen ones. The townspeople had long ago tried to forget the curse, but it seemed to have returned, reawakening with the recent deaths. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Was this really possible? Had the curse really come back? As I closed the folder, I heard a sound behind me, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on the wooden floor. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. I knew then that I had to leave. The air in the library felt thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Over the next few days, more people started to disappear. First, it was the town's mechanic, Mr. Anderson. Then, it was the grocery store owner, and even a few of the younger kids from school. The town was spiraling into chaos, and no one knew what to do. I could feel it now, the shadow of something ancient and malevolent creeping over the town, a force that couldn't be stopped. The deaths were just the beginning. I don't know if anyone in Maple Ridge will ever escape what's coming, but I can tell you this: the curse isn't over. The thing that has been stalking us is still out there, and I can only hope that I can survive long enough to uncover its secrets before it claims me too. I'll never forget that feeling, the feeling of being watched, the way the trees seem to whisper in the wind. There's something in Maple Ridge, something that no one can escape. And if you ever find yourself passing through, remember one thing: stay far, far away from the woods. Because if you don't, you might just become the next victim of the curse that never dies. I never believed in ghosts or curses or anything like that. I grew up in a small town called Oak Hollow, a place so quiet and peaceful it almost seemed like something out of a storybook. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where you could walk down Main Street without locking your doors, where nothing bad ever happened. Or at least, that's what we thought. I used to walk around Oak Hollow, breathing in the fresh air, admiring the old buildings and the green fields that stretched out in every direction. It felt like home, like it was a place where you could stay forever and nothing would ever change. That was before the deaths started. It all began with Mr. Andrews, a man who had lived in Oak Hollow longer than anyone could remember. He owned the old hardware store near the edge of town and had always been friendly, with a kind word for everyone who walked through his door. He was an old man, probably in his late 70s, but he still got up every morning and opened his shop at the crack of dawn. He never looked sick, and no one ever thought anything was wrong with him. But one Tuesday morning, Mr. Andrews didn't open the store. The whole town noticed, because his shop was the first stop for most people before they went to work. People knocked on his door, but there was no answer. Finally, someone called the sheriff, and when he arrived, they broke the door down. They found Mr. Andrews lying in the middle of his living room, face down, with his hands clenched at his sides. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious injury, just a peaceful, quiet death. The sheriff said it was probably a heart attack, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, 2 weeks later, the second death occurred. This time, it was Mrs. Caldwell, the town's beloved librarian. Mrs. Caldwell had been in Oak Hollow almost as long as Mr. Andrews, and like him, she was one of those people everyone loved. She was always there to help with school projects, to recommend a good book, to listen to anyone who needed advice. But one Friday evening, she was found in the back of the library, sitting in her chair. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. Her body was still warm when they found her, but she had been dead for hours. The cause of death was ruled as a sudden stroke. The sheriff didn't seem too concerned. After all, she was an older woman, and it wasn't unusual for people her age to pass away unexpectedly. But again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the deaths that bothered me. It was the way they seemed to happen so suddenly, without any warning. And there was something else, something deeper, something that started to feel like a presence lurking in the air. It was like the town had become different. The streets seemed quieter, the trees seemed darker, and there was a chill in the air even on the warmest days. People started talking, whispers about the strange deaths, about how they didn't feel natural, but everyone tried to push the fear aside, telling themselves it was just a coincidence, just bad luck. That was, until the third death happened. It was Tommy. Tommy was only 16, and he was one of my closest friends. We grew up together, spent hours playing baseball in the park, riding our bikes to the lake, getting into all kinds of trouble. He was always full of energy, always joking around. But one morning, Tommy didn't show up for school. His parents thought he was still asleep, but when they went to wake him up, they found him lying in bed, his face pale, his body cold. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious reason for his death. The doctors couldn't explain it. The sheriff seemed even more confused than he had been with the other deaths. At this point, the entire town was on edge. People were scared. Everyone started locking their doors at night, avoiding the streets after dark. There were rumors that spread like wildfire. Some said the town was cursed. Others said it was the work of a serial killer, but no one had any answers. A week after Tommy's death, I began to notice something strange. Every time I went outside, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certainty. like there was someone, or something, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. I started walking around town at night, trying to figure out what was going on. I don't know why I did it, but something inside me told me that I needed to understand what was happening. I wanted to get to the bottom of these deaths, to find the truth. That's when I saw it. One evening, I was walking past the old church on Maple Street, the one that had been abandoned for years. The windows were cracked, and the roof was caving in. It was always an eerie place, but that night, something about it felt wrong. As I walked closer, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, watching me. It was just a glimpse, but I swear it looked like a person. A person in dark, tattered clothing, standing perfectly still. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to turn and run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I took a deep breath and walked closer, my eyes scanning the shadows. But when I reached the church, there was no one there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure I had seen, wondering if it had been real or just my imagination. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that something had been moving through Oak Hollow, something that was leaving death in its wake. The next day, I decided to go to the town's historical archives. I knew that if I wanted to understand what was happening, I needed to know more about the town's past. The sheriff had told me that nothing like this had ever happened before, but I wasn't convinced. Oak Hollow had been around for over 150 years. There had to be something in its history that explained what was going on. I spent hours poring over old town records, newspaper clippings, and photographs. That's when I found it. There had been a similar series of deaths in Oak Hollow 100 years ago, in 1919. The town had experienced a strange plague, one that had taken the lives of several residents, all in the same mysterious manner. They had all died suddenly, without warning, with no clear explanation. The cause of death was never determined, but rumors circulated that it was the work of a spirit, a vengeful entity that had been awakened by something, perhaps the construction of the town itself. The more I read, the more I realized that the deaths of Mr. Andrews, Mrs. Caldwell, Tommy, and the others weren't the first time something like this had happened in Oak Hollow. There was something ancient, something dark that seemed to awaken every so often, taking lives and leaving fear in its wake. I don't know how I knew it, but deep down, I felt like the spirit was here again. I felt its presence, like a cold breath on the back of my neck, watching and waiting for the next victim. That night, I went to the church again. I wasn't sure why, but something told me I needed to be there. I stood in front of the crumbling building, staring into the darkness, when I saw the figure again. This time, it was clearer, standing in the doorway like a shadow, just watching me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped out of the church and into the street, its movements slow and deliberate. I backed away, but something compelled me to follow it. I followed the figure down the street, past the empty houses and darkened windows. It led me to the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, the one no one ever visited because it was said to be haunted. When we reached the cemetery gates, the figure turned to face me. It was then that I saw its face, or what was left of it. It was pale, hollow, with empty eyes that seemed to stare right through me. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from all around me, it spoke. "Death is a cycle," it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. "A cycle that cannot be broken." Before I could respond, the figure was gone, disappearing into the night like smoke. I ran back to my house that night, but the fear still lingers in Oak Hollow. People are still dying. The presence is still here. And I know now that Oak Hollow's dark past is never truly gone. It's just waiting for the next cycle to begin. And the worst part? I can still hear that whisper in my mind. Death is a cycle. My name is Lydia, and I grew up in a small, sleepy town called Havenbrook. It wasn't much of a town, really. Just a few streets, a couple of small shops, and a handful of old houses that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. It wasn't the kind of place where you expected anything to go wrong. People lived their lives in a peaceful routine, year after year. But that all changed the summer I turned 16. It started innocently enough, with a phone call from my best friend, Rachel. She was talking excitedly about the town's annual festival, which had always been the highlight of the year. "It's going to be amazing this time," she said. "I heard they're bringing in the old Ferris wheel from the fairgrounds, and there's going to be a haunted house this year. You have to come, Lydia." I had always been excited for the festival too. It was one of the few times of the year that the whole town would come together, everyone laughing and sharing stories. But that year, something felt off. There was a strange heaviness in the air. I couldn't quite explain it, but I didn't want to admit it to Rachel. After all, we'd been planning for this day for months, and I didn't want to spoil it. So, I went. I put on a brave face, even though the unease that had been growing inside me seemed to grow stronger as the day approached. The festival was everything Rachel had promised: bright lights, the smell of funnel cakes, laughter, and the usual bustle of Havenbrook's residents. People lined up for the Ferris wheel, the little children chased each other through the maze, and the sounds of old country music played over the speakers. But there was one thing that was different this year: the haunted house. It had always been part of the festival, but this time it was strange. I couldn't put my finger on it. The old shack where they had set it up was darker than usual, and the people standing outside it looked nervous. No one was in line to go in. It was almost like people were avoiding it, as if they were afraid of what might be inside. "Hey, Rachel, are you sure you want to go in?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "Oh, come on, Lydia. It's just a haunted house. It's all for fun," she said, pulling me toward the entrance with a grin. We walked inside, and immediately, the air seemed to grow colder. The walls of the house were damp, and the dim light flickered as we stepped deeper into the maze. I could feel something in the shadows, something watching us, but when I turned around, no one was there. "Lydia, stop being such a baby." Rachel laughed, trying to lighten the mood, but her voice wavered a little too. The first room was the usual setup: fake cobwebs, a few skeletons hanging from the ceiling, and a few eerie sound effects. But as we moved deeper, it started to feel different. The sounds in the house weren't just effects anymore. They felt real. Low whispers echoed in the walls, and faint footsteps seemed to follow us through the dark hallways. I was about to suggest we turn around when we came to the last room, the one everyone was talking about. The door creaked open slowly, and I gasped as I stepped inside. There was a figure standing in the center of the room, tall, cloaked, its face hidden in shadow. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching us. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the figure was gone. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Rachel, but she was gone. I called her name, my voice echoing in the darkness. I turned around and saw Rachel standing at the entrance, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Lydia, we need to get out of here. Now," she said, her voice shaky. We ran back through the house, but it was like the path had changed. The walls were shifting, twisting in impossible ways. We couldn't find the door. Then, I heard it, a soft whisper, low, drawn out. It seemed to come from all around us, the words too soft to make out. "Leave, or you will be next." Rachel grabbed my hand and yanked me toward the exit. But when we reached the door, it was locked. No matter how hard we pulled or how much we banged on it, it wouldn't open. "Leave, or you will be next." The voice was louder now, clearer. I could almost hear the smirk in it, the mocking tone. And then, the air seemed to press in on us. The temperature dropped drastically, and I could see my breath in front of me. Rachel was crying now, and I could feel myself starting to panic. But just as I was about to give up hope, the door flew open. I stumbled out into the night, gasping for air, and Rachel pulled me toward the main festival area. We didn't say anything as we walked through the crowd, but I could see the fear in her eyes. I knew she felt it too. We were both shaken. The whisper in the haunted house hadn't been part of the act. It had been real. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The voice, the figure, the way the house had felt. I knew something was wrong. But the strangest part was when I checked my phone. Rachel had texted me just before we went into the haunted house. "Don't go in. The house isn't part of the festival anymore." It made no sense. Rachel had been with me the whole time. She hadn't sent the message. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just some strange coincidence. But deep down, I knew I had to find out more. The next morning, I went to the festival grounds with Rachel. We were both too scared to go back into the haunted house, but we needed answers. We spoke to the organizers, asking about the house and the strange things that had happened the night before. That's when we learned something that made my blood run cold. The haunted house had been built in the same spot where a fire had occurred years ago. In 1947, there had been a tragic accident in Havenbrook. A family of 5 had perished in a fire, and no one ever figured out how it started. It was ruled as an accident, but rumors had spread that the fire had been set deliberately, and that the family's spirits still haunted the place. The house had been abandoned after the fire, but for some reason, it was rebuilt every year for the festival. No one had ever wanted to talk about the past, and for years, the house had been part of the fun. But this year was different. A few days later, Rachel and I returned to the site of the haunted house. We were both curious, but also terrified. Something told me we weren't supposed to be there, but we couldn't help it. We had to know what had happened. We snuck into the abandoned house, the place where the festival organizers kept all the old props and decorations. It was dark, cold, and smelled musty, and as soon as we stepped inside, we saw it. A set of old pictures, faded and yellowing, pinned to the wall. They showed the family that had lived here before the fire. They were a happy family, smiling in front of their house. But one of the pictures stood out. A man, his face distorted and twisted in rage. The back of the photo was marked with the date, 1947, the year of the fire. Rachel gasped, "Lydia, do you think this is what happened?" Before I could answer, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, even though the windows were sealed tight. The picture of the man seemed to move. His eyes, they were watching us. Then, I heard it, the same voice from the haunted house. "Leave, or you will be next." We ran out of there as fast as we could, not looking back. I don't know what happened in Havenbrook that night, or what the man's spirit wanted, but I can tell you one thing for sure. The deaths that happened in our town weren't accidents, and they weren't caused by natural causes. I don't know if anyone else in Havenbrook noticed, but the town was changing. People were disappearing, their bodies turning up in strange places, never really explained. The whispers grew louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And every time I close my eyes, I hear it again. "Leave, or you will be next." But I don't think anyone can leave. I don't think anyone can escape Havenbrook's curse. Not after the fire. Not after the lost souls that still haunt this place. And if you ever find yourself here, I urge you, stay away from the old house. Because once you hear that whisper, it's already too late. There's something I have to tell you, though it's been hard to find the words. My name is Ethan, and I grew up in a small town called Brookville. If you've never heard of it, don't worry. It's one of those quiet, sleepy places where everyone knows everyone, and not much ever seems to happen. But that's the thing about small towns. They hide things, terrible things. Things that, if you're unlucky enough, will make you wish you never stepped foot there in the first place. I had always loved Brookville. It was home, and even though it wasn't much, just a handful of houses, a few shops, and a couple of old barns, it felt safe. People went about their business without question. Every summer, we had our little fair, and every winter, the town square was decorated with lights that made the place feel like something out of a storybook. But all of that changed when the death started. I was 17 when it all began. My best friend, Sam, was the first to notice that something was wrong. It was late in the fall, just as the air started to cool, and the trees began losing their leaves. Sam and I had always walked through the woods behind our school, talking about life, school, and our plans for the future. We often made jokes about how Brookville felt like the perfect setting for a horror movie. Nothing ever seemed to happen, and yet there was this constant, almost oppressive stillness about the place. That was before the first death. It was Mrs. Harper. She was a quiet woman, in her early 50s, who lived at the edge of town in a house that was always neatly kept, the garden always blooming. Mrs. Harper had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember. She didn't have family in town, and she kept to herself most of the time. No one really knew much about her except that she kept to a strict routine. Every morning she would walk to the market. Every afternoon she'd tend to her garden, and by evening, she would be inside, never seen again until the next day. But one Tuesday morning, she didn't show up at the market. People assumed she was sick, but then came Wednesday, and still, no Mrs. Harper. The neighbors grew concerned and called the sheriff, who came over and knocked on her door. When there was no answer, he broke in, only to find her sitting in her chair by the window, looking out at the street as if she were waiting for someone. There was nothing to indicate how she had died. No signs of a struggle, no marks on her body, and nothing unusual. It was like she had just stopped. There was no explanation. The sheriff said it was probably a stroke, but the way her body was positioned, staring out the window into the empty street, unsettled everyone. It felt wrong. It felt like something wasn't right, but no one could put their finger on it. The town was shaken, but life moved on. Brookville wasn't the kind of place where people stayed scared for long. We went about our business, but deep down, we all knew something had shifted. It was the silence after her death that lingered. But then, 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time, it was Mr. Jenkins, the elderly man who ran the local hardware store. Mr. Jenkins was a fixture in town. He had been around forever, and anyone who needed a screw or a hammer, or even advice about fixing something would stop by his store. He was always helpful, always friendly. But one evening, the store closed early, and no one saw him again for a few days. When they found him, he was sitting behind the counter in the back of his store, a half-finished cup of coffee beside him. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. His mouth was slightly open, like he had been about to say something, but the words never came. Just like Mrs. Harper, there were no signs of injury, no heart attack, no stroke. He was just gone. And again, there was a chilling silence that followed. People started whispering. It was around this time that Sam and I started talking about it more seriously. We were both starting to notice a strange pattern. The deaths weren't random. They were happening in a certain rhythm, almost like clockwork, and each death seemed to leave an emptiness behind, a void that no one could explain. The third death came a month later, and it hit harder than the others. It was my own mother. My mom wasn't as old as Mrs. Harper or Mr. Jenkins, but she had lived in Brookville for most of her life, and she was loved by everyone. She was the kind of person who always helped others, always put the town's needs before her own. She had been healthy, vibrant, and full of life just days before she passed. But one afternoon, she was found lying in the living room, her hands folded neatly on her chest, as though she had been resting peacefully. The house was locked from the inside. Nothing had been stolen, no sign of forced entry. She was just gone. Her expression was serene, as though she had simply slipped away in her sleep. But I knew better. I could feel it in my gut. Something wasn't right. The sheriff said it was natural causes. He said it was just another stroke, like the others. But I knew there was something connecting these deaths, something deeper than mere coincidence. By then, people were starting to panic. We were all afraid, but no one dared to say anything out loud. Who could we blame? What could we do? It wasn't like there was an explanation. The deaths didn't make sense, and the town didn't know how to react. That's when the whispers began. Some said the town was cursed. They spoke in hushed tones, mostly at night, in the corners of bars or behind closed doors. The older folks talked about things that had happened long before my time, things that didn't make sense. They spoke of a time during the 1800s when a family had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but an abandoned farmhouse that still stood at the edge of town. Some said the family had angered something, a spirit or force, that lived deep in the woods. Others said the family had been part of a terrible ritual that went wrong. As the deaths continued, so did the whispers. Sam and I, both desperate for answers, went to the old farmhouse one night. We had heard rumors that it was haunted, but we needed to know the truth. The house had been abandoned for years, and when we finally found it, it was just as eerie as everyone had described. The windows were boarded up, the door creaked when we opened it, and the smell of decay filled the air. Inside, the house was filled with old furniture covered in dust, and the walls were lined with peeling wallpaper. But in the center of the room, there was a strange symbol carved into the floor, worn down with age. It looked almost like an eye, and beneath it were letters written in a language I couldn't recognize. Sam was standing next to it, his face pale. "Do you think this has something to do with the deaths?" I asked. Before he could answer, we heard something from behind us. A soft, slow shuffle of footsteps. We turned around, but no one was there. I felt my stomach drop. Something was wrong. We ran out of the house, and when we reached the edge of the woods, we heard a voice. "Leave now. You are next." It was a whisper, so faint we almost didn't hear it, but we both froze. The air around us seemed to grow colder, and every hair on my body stood on end. From that night on, I began to feel like I was being watched. Everywhere I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, following me, waiting for the right moment. Every time I walked through Brookville, I saw shadows in the corner of my eyes. People were dying, yes, but they weren't really gone. They were still here, trapped in the town. I don't know how much longer this town will hold on. People still die, one after the other, and no one knows why. No one talks about it anymore. They just whisper about the past. They try to ignore the truth, but it's there, buried beneath the surface. Brookville isn't a town anymore. It's a place of lost souls where shadows walk the streets and the air is thick with the scent of death. If you ever find yourself near Brookville, I have only one piece of advice. Keep driving. Keep going until the town fades away in the rearview mirror. Because once you hear the whispers, it's already too late. I've never told anyone this story, not because I don't want to, but because I'm not sure anyone would believe me. My name is Megan, and I grew up in Hollow Creek, a small town nestled between towering hills and dense woods. The kind of town you only pass through if you're lost or looking for a shortcut. It wasn't a place you stayed for long. Everyone knew everyone else, and everyone kept to themselves. It was quiet, serene, even peaceful. At least, that's how it seemed on the surface. I was just 16 when things started to change, but no one saw it coming. It started innocently enough, with a few strange occurrences, but over time, the tension grew. By the time I left, the town I once knew was no more. The first death was of Mr. Davis, the elderly man who lived on the outskirts of town. He was a quiet, solitary figure, never much of a talker. He lived in a small cabin on the edge of the woods, which always seemed to be a little too close to the dark trees. People said that Mr. Davis had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. His hair was thin and white, his back hunched with age, and his eyes were distant, like someone who had seen too much. No one really knew where he came from or why he had chosen to live in that cabin, but there were rumors. Some said he had been a war veteran, others that he had some sort of family tragedy, but he never spoke about it. I had seen him around town occasionally. He would walk into the grocery store in the mornings, buy just a loaf of bread and a carton of milk, and leave without a word. The townsfolk would greet him, but he never responded. Most people didn't think much of him. It wasn't until the morning they found his body that things started to unravel. It was a Tuesday, just after the sun had risen, when Sheriff Caldwell called for everyone to gather at the town square. The news spread quickly, and by mid-morning, most of Hollow Creek had assembled, murmuring amongst themselves, unsure of what was going on. Mr. Davis had been found dead in his cabin, but that wasn't what shocked us. What shocked us was how he had died. His body was cold, his face pale, and his hands were gripped tightly around the old wooden chair he had been sitting in. But it wasn't the position that was unusual, it was the marks on his neck. They weren't from strangulation, not exactly. They were like deep gouges, as if something sharp had pierced into his skin. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just the gaping, deep indentations, like something had dragged him from his chair. No one knew what to make of it. The sheriff assumed it was a heart attack, maybe an old injury catching up to him, but I knew it wasn't that. The town knew it wasn't that. There was something unnatural about the whole situation. The woods, the marks, the coldness that seemed to hang over the cabin like a shroud. A week later, another death. This time, it was Mrs. Peterson, the woman who ran the local bakery. She was in her 40s, married with 2 young children, and always had a smile on her face. Her baked goods were the best in the county, and she was known for her kindness. She was a staple in the community, someone you could always count on. But when they found her, she wasn't smiling. She was found in her bakery late one night, her body sprawled out on the floor, eyes wide open, and her face frozen in a look of pure terror. The bakery was locked from the inside, and the windows were secure. No signs of forced entry. It was as if she had been caught completely off guard. Sheriff Caldwell conducted an investigation, but there were no clear answers. Her body had been moved in an unnatural way, twisted and contorted, as if she had been dragged and then left there in haste. No marks, no wounds, just the expression on her face, the terror that was etched into her features. I remember walking past her bakery that night, the lights off, the window reflecting a dark and empty street. I hadn't known then that she was gone. It wasn't until the next day that I found out, and that's when the whispers started. People said Mrs. Peterson had been cursed. They said she had angered someone or something, and that was why she had died the way she did. Others said it was just an accident, a random death that couldn't be explained. But those of us who had seen the fear in her eyes, who had felt the chill in the air that night, we knew it wasn't that simple. A pattern was beginning to form, and it wasn't good. The third death happened a month later. This time, it was young Thomas Richards, a boy no older than 12. He had been playing in the woods with his friends when he disappeared. At first, the town assumed he had just wandered off, maybe gotten lost in the dense trees. But when they found him, his body was nowhere near the path he had been on. He was discovered in the deepest part of the forest, near the old well that no one ever used anymore. Thomas was found kneeling by the well, his hands pressed into the dirt as if he were praying. But his face was twisted in horror, his mouth open in a silent scream. The sheriff called it a tragic accident, maybe an animal attack or a fall. But anyone who saw the look on his face knew it wasn't an accident. There were no animal tracks, no signs of a struggle, just his body, bent unnaturally beside that old well, as if he had been waiting for something. I began to feel it then, the growing unease that hovered over Hollow Creek like a cloud. It was more than just the deaths. It was the atmosphere, the strange feeling that something had shifted in the town, something that we couldn't undo. The woods were darker now, the air colder, the streets quieter. People began to avoid the town square at night, and no one dared to walk near the forest after dark. But the worst part wasn't the deaths. It was what followed them. I started hearing things. In the dead of night, when I would lie awake in bed, I could hear soft whispers coming from the direction of the woods. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like the wind or the trees moving. But it was always there, a low, soothing voice, murmuring just out of reach. And then came the dreams. Every night, I would dream of the woods, the same dream over and over. I would walk through the trees, the ground soft beneath my feet, until I reached the old well. I would stand there, staring down into its black depths, and something would pull me closer. Something would call me from the bottom. Its voice so familiar, so comforting, that I couldn't resist. I had to go. I had to look. I would reach out, my hand trembling, my breath caught in my chest, and then I would wake up, my heart pounding in my ears. Each time I woke, I felt as though something was waiting for me, watching me. Then, one day, I decided to go to the well. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the dreams, the feeling of being hunted by something unseen. I had to know what was happening to Hollow Creek. It was late afternoon when I made my way to the woods. The trees were thick with the smell of damp earth, the path barely visible as I walked deeper into the forest. The air was cold, though it was still early in the season. The silence of the woods pressed against my ears, louder than the normal noises of nature. I felt every step as if the earth itself was holding its breath. When I reached the well, I felt that familiar pull, the same feeling that had come to me in my dreams. The well was older than I remembered, cracked and weathered by time, the stones chipped and worn, but there was something else, something different. A faint glow emanated from the bottom of the well, as if something was glowing just below the surface. I couldn't resist. I leaned over the edge, my hands gripping the rough stone, and peered into the depths. At first, I saw nothing, but then I saw them. Faces. Faces of the people who had died. Mr. Davis, Mrs. Peterson, Thomas. Their faces were frozen in fear, their eyes wide and staring, their mouths open as if they were screaming for help. And then I heard it. The voice. You should have stayed away. The ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. Something dark and ancient was waiting in the well. Something that had been here long before the town was built. Something that had been waking up, one death at a time. That was the last time I stepped into Hollow Creek. The town is empty now, silent. No one lives there anymore. No one dares to. The woods have claimed it, and the well is still there, waiting. The deaths never truly stopped. They were just the beginning. If you ever find yourself near Hollow Creek, don't go looking for the town. Don't listen to the whispers. And most importantly, don't approach the well. Because once you do, once you hear the voice, you'll never leave. I remember the day we moved to Briarwood as though it was yesterday, though it's been almost a decade. My family and I had spent most of our lives in the city, the noise and chaos always surrounding us. So, when my parents decided it was time for a change, time for a quieter, slower life, we all packed up and moved to Briarwood, a small town tucked away in the hills, surrounded by thick woods. At first, everything seemed perfect. Briarwood was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time. It was peaceful, charming even. The houses were old but well kept, the people friendly and welcoming. There was something about it that felt almost like stepping back into a simpler time. The kind of place where everyone greeted you with a smile, where people would stop by and chat on the front porch, and where everyone knew your name. It was everything we thought we wanted. But it didn't take long before the cracks started to show. It wasn't the people. They were kind enough, at least on the surface. It was the town itself. There was something strange about Briarwood. A heaviness, an underlying tension that no one ever seemed to talk about. At first, it was easy to ignore, but as time went on, it became impossible to deny. It started with Old Man Lyle, who lived 2 streets over from us. He was a fixture in the town, an eccentric old man who everyone seemed to know but no one really understood. He had lived in Briarwood for as long as anyone could remember. His house was a ramshackle thing on the outskirts of town, hidden behind overgrown trees and vines. People would often say that he had a dark history, but never explained what they meant. It was one of those things that you learn not to ask about. One cold autumn evening, I was walking home from school with my little brother, Mark, when we passed Lyle's house. The front door was ajar, and a strange, unnatural stillness hung in the air. Mark, being a curious little kid, asked if we should check on him, but I quickly told him to keep walking. Something about the house just felt wrong that day. As we moved past, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know why, but I had an overwhelming sense that something bad had happened inside that house. The next morning, Lyle was dead. It was Sheriff Dawson who found him, though no one could explain how he died. Lyle's body was discovered slumped in his chair in front of the fireplace, a cup of cold coffee on the table next to him. But it wasn't the position or the setting that was strange. It was the expression on his face. His eyes were wide open, but they weren't just staring. They were filled with pure terror. His mouth was open, as if he had tried to scream but couldn't. There was no sign of injury, no signs of struggle, no blood, no marks on his skin. The coroner ruled it as a heart attack, but everyone knew that wasn't the case. It didn't fit. There was something in the air that made it feel wrong, like Lyle's death was a warning, but no one knew what that warning was. The sheriff said it was just an old man's heart giving out, but it didn't feel that way to me. It felt like something darker, something that had been lurking just beneath the surface of Briarwood, waiting for the right time to strike. And it wasn't just me who felt it. The whole town was shaken by Lyle's death, even if no one would admit it openly. People began to look at each other strangely, and the streets grew quieter. The kind of quiet you only hear when something is very wrong. A few weeks later, the second death occurred. This time, it was Mrs. Bennett, the sweet elderly woman who lived next to us. She was the kind of person who always made you feel welcome, the kind who baked pies for the neighbors and always had a story to tell. I had spent many afternoons in her cozy little house, listening to her talk about the town's history, her eyes twinkling with excitement as she told me about the old days. But Mrs. Bennett's death was nothing like Lyle's. It was worse. One evening, my mother went over to check on her after she hadn't been answering her phone. She'd been feeling under the weather, and my mom thought it was strange that no one had heard from her in days. When she arrived at Mrs. Bennett's house, the door was wide open. My mother called out, but there was no response. She stepped inside, and that's when she saw it. Mrs. Bennet was lying in the middle of the living room floor, her body stiff, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. But what made my mother's blood run cold was the way she had been positioned. Mrs. Bennet's body had been arranged carefully, almost lovingly, with her hands folded across her chest and her legs crossed. The only thing out of place was the strange, jagged black marks on her neck. They looked like something had clawed at her skin from the inside. Again, there was no sign of a struggle, no sign of forced entry. It was like Mrs. Bennet had simply died in her sleep, but she hadn't. Something had taken her. And again, the sheriff was quick to dismiss it as a natural death. But no one believed him. Not after what happened to Lyle. By this point, the town was on edge. People stopped walking alone after dark. Some of the older residents, the ones who knew Briarwood's history better than anyone, began to whisper. They spoke of things that had happened long ago, things that most of us had never heard about. They spoke of a curse, an old curse that had been placed on the town many years ago. A curse that had been waiting for the right moment to resurface. No one knew the full story, but the pieces were starting to fit together. Briarwood wasn't just any town. It had a dark, bloody past. The kind of past that you only hear about in old folk tales. There were whispers of ritualistic sacrifices, strange happenings in the woods, and a family, now long gone, who had lived in the old mansion on the hill. It was said that the family had made a terrible pact, a pact that had cursed the land itself. And now, the curse was taking its toll, one life at a time. The third death was the hardest. It was my own mother. She had been at home one evening, preparing dinner when she suddenly fell silent. My father, who had been in the garage, heard nothing at first, but when he came inside, he found her standing in the hallway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't speak a word, just stood there, staring at something only she could see. Before my father could ask her what was wrong, she collapsed. She didn't scream, didn't cry out. She simply dropped to the floor, dead. The doctors couldn't find a cause. They said it was cardiac arrest, just like with Lyle. But I knew better. I had felt it the moment I walked into the house. It wasn't just a death. It was a message. The sheriff conducted another investigation, but like the others, he found nothing unusual. No signs of foul play. No evidence that anything out of the ordinary had happened. Just like with Lyle. Just like with Mrs. Bennet. Nothing. But I knew something was out there. Watching. Waiting. It wasn't until after my mother's funeral that I decided to visit the old mansion on the hill. I had heard stories about it all my life. The decaying house that no one ever dared to go near. The mansion that loomed over the town like a shadow. I went alone. The mansion was even more imposing up close. The windows were boarded up, the front door hanging crooked on its hinges. But there was something about it that called to me, a pull I couldn't ignore. I pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. Inside, it was as if time had stopped. The furniture was old, the air thick with dust, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. But in the center of the room, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A symbol. It was etched into the floor, a strange, intricate pattern that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. I recognized it immediately. My grandmother had once told me about it. It was an ancient symbol, one that had been used in dark rituals long ago. A symbol meant to summon something evil. That's when I heard it. A voice, a soft whisper, just at the edge of hearing. You shouldn't have come. And that was when I realized the truth. The curse wasn't just a story. It was real, and I was part of it now. Briarwood's blood had been spilled, and the town would never be free. That night, as I left the mansion, I saw it, just for a moment. A shadow, moving in the trees, watching, waiting. And I knew, in my heart, that Briarwood would never be the same again. Not for me, not for anyone. If you ever find yourself near Briarwood, don't stop. Keep driving. Keep going. Because once you hear the whispers, once you see the shadow in the trees, it's already too late. Briarwood will have you, just like it had me. I've never been the superstitious type. I grew up in a small town, Carver's Hollow, where people would tell you all sorts of wild stories. As a kid, I thought it was just harmless fun. My friends and I would dare each other to visit the old cemetery at midnight or prank the old man who lived on the hill, but deep down, I never truly believed any of the stories. That is, until the night everything changed. Carver's Hollow wasn't much, just a handful of houses and a few small shops nestled between the rolling hills. Everyone knew everyone else. It was the kind of town where secrets didn't stay secret for long. But there were always whispers. Whispers about the people who had disappeared. Whispers about the strange happenings in the woods at the edge of town. At the center of all these stories was the night of the blood moon, an event that had occurred only once in living memory many years ago. I first heard the story from my grandmother when I was a child. She would tell it to me in a hushed voice, as if it were a warning. She spoke of a time when Carver's Hollow was much smaller, when people believed that something was hidden in the woods, a dark, ancient force that could only be awakened during the rare occurrence of a blood moon. A night where the moon appeared unnaturally red, casting an eerie glow over the land. And when that moon rose, something sinister was said to happen. Back then, I thought it was just a creepy story to scare children. But as I grew older, I began to hear more unsettling tales. People would speak in hushed tones about strange disappearances, unexplained deaths, and eerie lights seen in the woods. The town tried to push these stories aside, but they lingered, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken off. Then, one year, it happened again. The blood moon. It was late October, the leaves falling from the trees, and the air had a sharp chill to it. The local farmers were wrapping up their harvests, and the town seemed busier than usual. There was a sense of unease in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I remember walking home from school that afternoon, feeling the weight of something unknown pressing down on me. That night, the moon rose, casting an ominous red glow across the sky. It looked as if it were bleeding into the heavens, like some forgotten omen had finally come to pass. As I looked up, I felt my heart race. Something about that moon felt different. It wasn't just the color. It was the way it seemed to hang in the sky, watching over us. At first, I brushed it off. It was just a lunar phenomenon, I told myself, but deep down, I knew there was something wrong. Something ancient and powerful that stirred when the moon rose that night. And that feeling only grew stronger as the night wore on. By the time the clock struck midnight, Carver's Hollow had fallen eerily silent. The usual late-night sounds of crickets and rustling leaves had disappeared, replaced by an unsettling stillness. I had just turned off the lights and climbed into bed when I heard a noise outside my window. It was faint at first, just a rustling sound coming from the woods behind my house, but then it grew louder, closer. Curious and more than a little frightened, I cautiously got out of bed and went to the window. The trees were swaying in the breeze, their shadows twisting across the ground. But there was something more. A faint glow, like fireflies, flickering in the distance. I knew the woods beyond the town had always been a place of mystery, but this was different. The glow seemed to pulse, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw figures moving within it. They were too far away to make out clearly, but something about the way they moved sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't natural. There was no sound, just a sense of wrongness that permeated the air. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But then, I heard a voice, a whisper, just barely audible, but unmistakable. "Come to us." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, like something ancient, something not of this world. I felt a chill run through me, but curiosity overpowered my fear. I had to know what was out there. I grabbed my jacket and slipped out the back door, making my way toward the woods. As I stepped onto the familiar dirt path that led into the forest, I felt a strange pull, as if the woods themselves were guiding me. The further I walked, the more intense the glow became. It wasn't coming from fireflies, like I had thought. It was coming from something far more dangerous. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking when I reached a clearing in the woods. The light was almost blinding now, and I could hear whispers all around me. Low, guttural voices that seemed to come from the very earth beneath my feet. I was paralyzed with fear, but I couldn't turn back. Something was drawing me closer. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone altar, ancient and covered in moss. It looked as though it had been there for centuries. The stone was slick with something dark, blood, maybe, but it wasn't the altar that held my attention. It was the people standing around it. There were 4 of them, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods, their bodies cloaked in shadow. They were chanting in a language I didn't understand, their voices rising in a rhythmic chant that seemed to reverberate through the ground. And on the altar, lying motionless, was a body. I could barely make out the details, but I recognized the figure immediately. It was Jack Turner, the local mechanic. He had been missing for 3 days, and now I knew why. He wasn't dead yet, but he was barely alive, his body pale and lifeless, as if drained of all energy. The figures around the altar continued their chant, and I could feel the power in the air, thick and heavy. It was as if the very earth was trembling beneath me. And then, as the moon reached its peak in the sky, something began to happen. The altar stone seemed to glow, a bright red light pulsating from it. And then Jack's body began to twitch, his limbs jerking violently as though something was controlling him from the inside. The figures around the altar moved closer, their hands raised as they continued their chant. I could see now that they weren't human. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their faces were twisted, distorted, like something from a nightmare. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, unable to move, as if the very air around me was holding me captive. The chanting grew louder, more intense, until it seemed to fill the entire forest. And then, as the blood moon reached its peak, Jack's body was lifted from the altar, hovering in the air above it. I could hear the sound of bones cracking, skin tearing, as something began to emerge from within him. A shadow, a dark, twisted form, began to materialize above him, its shape shifting like smoke. It was impossible to look at it directly, but I could feel its presence, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. The figure let out a low, guttural growl, and with one final scream from Jack, the creature fully emerged, its eyes glowing with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The light from the blood moon dimmed, the whispers faded, and the figures around the altar fell silent. The creature was gone, and so was Jack. There was nothing left but the remnants of the ritual. I don't know how I managed to escape that night. Somehow, my legs started moving again, and I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, back through the woods and into the safety of my home. But even now, I can't escape the memories. The sounds, the images, they haunt me every day. The next morning, when I told the sheriff what I had seen, he just shook his head. There's nothing in those woods, son. People tell stories, but that's all they are. Stories, but I know the truth. I saw it with my own eyes. And that night, during the blood moon, Carver's Hollow had changed forever. There have been others since then. Disappearances, strange deaths, people who wander into the woods and never return. The town tries to go on like nothing happened, but I know better. The curse that has haunted Carver's Hollow is still alive, waiting for the next blood moon to rise. If you ever find yourself in Carver's Hollow, stay away from the woods. And if you see the blood moon in the sky, turn around and run. Because once the blood is spilled, the creatures that lurk in the darkness will come for you, just as they came for Jack. And once they do, there is no escaping. My name is Alex, and I've lived in Blackstone Ridge for most of my life. It's a small, quiet town, nestled between 2 mountain ridges, where the streets are lined with old houses and the air always smells like pine and earth. People move here to escape the bustle of city life, and it's easy to see why. It's peaceful. Too peaceful, in fact. There's a stillness that hangs over the town, like the calm before a storm, but no one ever talks about it. At least, not openly. Growing up, I had always been told that Blackstone Ridge was a special place. My parents would say it had history, good history, they would say. But as I grew older, I started hearing other things. Whispers, strange stories, and when I turned 16, I started to understand what those stories were about. It all began with the death of Mrs. Hargraves, an elderly widow who lived 2 houses down from us. She was a sweet old woman, always out in her garden tending to her roses, and she had lived in Blackstone Ridge for as long as anyone could remember. Her house was a beautiful old thing, the kind of house you see in history books, with creaking floors and tall windows that caught the last rays of sunlight in the evening. One morning, I woke up to find my parents talking in hushed voices in the kitchen. There had been a lot of commotion the night before, but I was too tired to pay attention. Now, I heard snippets of the conversation. They say she died in her sleep, but she looked terrified, my mother was saying. That's what I heard too. And the neighbors, they say her house was colder than it should have been, my dad added. I hadn't thought much of it at first. People die all the time, right? But when I walked outside that morning, I saw the ambulance parked outside her house, and a chill ran down my spine. Mrs. Hargraves had been perfectly fine just the day before. She had waved to me as I walked to school, smiling that warm, familiar smile. Now, she was dead, and no one could explain why. The sheriff, Sheriff Thompson, called it a natural death, but something about that didn't sit right with me. I had seen Mrs. Hargraves more than just a few times over the past couple of weeks. She had seemed uneasy, as if something was bothering her. She would often look over her shoulder when she walked from her car to the house, and I noticed she had started keeping the windows tightly shut, even on sunny days. As the days passed, more people started to talk. Whispers circulated about the strange occurrences in Mrs. Hargraves' house, things moving on their own, the house being inexplicably cold, and the odd shadow that was sometimes seen in the window at night. No one could explain it, but the rumors kept coming. Some said the house was cursed, others claimed it was something far worse, that Mrs. Hargraves had made a pact with something dark. And then came the second death. It was a week later when we learned that Dr. Jenkins, the town's local physician, had died suddenly. He was a strong man, always healthy and energetic, the kind of person who seemed untouchable by illness or age. But one morning, his wife found him slumped over his desk at home, dead from what the coroner called a heart attack. But it was more than just the cause of death that sent a shiver through the town. It was the look on his face when they found him. He had been gripped by an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide open, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. That same coldness had been mentioned in Mrs. Hargraves' case, and it was now showing up with Dr. Jenkins. People started to connect the dots. Everyone was beginning to wonder if these deaths were somehow connected, but the sheriff insisted it was just a coincidence. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. After Dr. Jenkins' death, people began to grow nervous. The stories from the older residents of Blackstone Ridge started to resurface. Stories about the Whispering Woods, a dense forest that bordered the town. It wasn't a place that people ventured into often, but the older folks had always warned us to stay away from it. The woods had an eerie reputation. Strange sounds were often heard there at night. Whispers, like voices carried on the wind, or the rustling of footsteps when no one was around. Some even claimed that the woods had a strange power, that it was a place where the line between life and death was thinner than anywhere else. I tried to ignore the stories. I really did. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the deaths weren't a coincidence at all. Mrs. Hargraves and Dr. Jenkins weren't the only ones. There had been others before them. People who had lived in Blackstone Ridge for years, quietly slipping away without explanation. And each time, the town had moved on without asking questions. But now, with the second death so close to home, people were starting to wonder. Then, on a cold December evening, something happened that would change everything. I was walking home from a friend's house when I saw it. The mist had rolled in, thick and heavy, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I was just a block away from my house when I noticed a shadow in the mist. Someone standing in front of Mrs. Hargraves' old house. The house had been abandoned since her death, and no one had lived there since. Curious, I stepped closer, wondering if it was just some stranger. But then I saw it clearly. A figure, draped in a dark cloak, standing perfectly still in front of the house. It was almost as if the figure was watching me, though I couldn't see their face. The air around them felt colder than it had been before, and I felt an instinctive shiver run down my spine. I knew then that I had to get away, but just as I turned to leave, the figure spoke. "Do you know what's hidden in the woods?" The voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to send me into a full panic. I ran home as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached my front door, I turned around to look back, but the figure was gone. The mist had swallowed them whole, like they had never been there at all. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, my mind racing, thinking about the figure and the question they had asked me. What's hidden in the woods? I kept asking myself, but I had no answer. The next day, things took an even darker turn. The sheriff's office announced that another person had been found dead, Tommy Reynolds, a local farmer who lived just outside town. He had been found in his barn, the same eerie expression on his face that Mrs. Hargraves and Dr. Jenkins had worn. The town was in shock, but for me, it was like a cold hand had closed around my throat. I knew, without a doubt, that the deaths were all connected, and that whatever was happening was tied to the woods. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know the truth. That night, under the cover of darkness, I made my way to the edge of the whispering woods. My heart was racing as I stepped onto the overgrown path that led deeper into the trees. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. The further I walked, the colder it became, until it felt like the temperature had dropped by several degrees. And then, just as I reached the heart of the woods, I saw it. A clearing, bathed in an unnatural light. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, covered in moss and ancient markings. It looked as though it had been there for centuries, but it wasn't the altar that drew my attention. It was the people standing around it, cloaked figures, just like the one I had seen near Mrs. Hargrave's house. They were chanting in low, rhythmic voices, their heads bowed in reverence to something unseen. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I watched them. What was this? What had they done to cause all these deaths? Before I could move, one of the figures turned, their hood falling back just enough to reveal their face. It was Sheriff Thompson. His eyes were wide with madness, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. "You should never have come here, Alex," he said, his voice chilling. "It's too late now." With those words, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground in the woods, the first light of dawn filtering through the trees. I was alone. The chanting had stopped. The figures had vanished. I don't know how I escaped, but I do know one thing. I never went back to the woods again. Blackstone Ridge is a town with secrets, secrets that are buried deep within those woods. The deaths will continue, one by one, as long as the pact is honored. If you ever find yourself near Blackstone Ridge, don't go near the woods. Don't listen to the whispers, and don't trust anyone who talks about the past, because some secrets are better left undisturbed. Dusk Hollow was never a town that drew much attention. Tucked away in the mountains, it had all the charm of a forgotten place, with small, crumbling houses, a dilapidated old church, and a single, winding road that led in and out of town. Growing up, I never thought much of it. It was just home, quiet, uneventful, and safe, or so I thought. But the events of the summer I turned 17 changed everything. That summer, a series of strange and tragic deaths began to unfold in Dusk Hollow, one after another, each one more unsettling than the last. What made it even stranger was that no one seemed to know why. And as I delved deeper into the mystery, I learned that some things are better left unknown. It started with Mr. Thompson, the town's oldest resident. Everyone knew him as a kind, gentle man who had lived in Dusk Hollow for as long as anyone could remember. He'd been a teacher in the local school decades ago, a man of wisdom who never seemed to age. Mr. Thompson had an uncanny ability to remember every child who had ever passed through his classroom, and he often spoke about the old days with a longing that left a strange ache in my chest. There was something comforting about him, something familiar. But one morning, we found his body lying in the middle of Main Street, just outside his house. He was face down, and when the sheriff arrived, he discovered that Mr. Thompson's body was unnaturally stiff, his hands tightly clenched into fists. But what was most disturbing was his face. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, his mouth frozen in a grotesque grin, as if he had died in the middle of a nightmare. His body had an unsettling, pale quality, almost like it had been drained of all color. It was the first death, and it shook Dusk Hollow to its core. But there was no explanation. The sheriff's office ruled it as a heart attack, though no one could figure out why someone so healthy would suddenly drop dead in such a bizarre way. Whispers began to spread, but no one dared speak too loudly. No one wanted to upset the fragile peace of the town. After all, this was a small town. In a small town, rumors and fears spread quickly, and everyone knew that once something was said, it would echo through every corner of the place. But the deaths didn't stop with Mr. Thompson. A few days later, Mrs. Holloway, the owner of the general store, was found dead in her apartment above the shop. She was a woman in her early 60s, known for her strict but fair ways. I had always admired her. She was the kind of person who kept things together, who always knew what to do in a crisis. But when we found her, it was as though the life had been sucked out of her. Her body lay motionless on the floor, her skin eerily pale, and like Mr. Thompson, her eyes were wide open, locked in a stare of terror. It was as though she had seen something horrible in her last moments. The town was in a state of panic now. Everyone tried to go about their daily routines, but there was a tension in the air, a heaviness that weighed down even the simplest of actions. And then, a week later, there was another death. It was James Carter, the town's mechanic, found dead in his shop, his body hanging from a rope tied to the rafters. But when they cut him down, his body showed no signs of struggling. His face, like the others, was locked in that same expression of terror. His hands were relaxed, not gripping the rope in any way. And it wasn't just that. There was a strange smell in the shop, something earthy and foul, almost like the scent of rotting leaves. At this point, even the bravest souls in Dusk Hollow were beginning to fear that something was terribly wrong. The townspeople began to suspect foul play, but no one could explain it. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no indication of what might be causing these deaths. And as the bodies piled up, the rumors grew more wild. Some said it was the curse of the Hollow. Others whispered about a ghost that had been haunting the town for years. And there were even those who said the fog itself, which rolled in every evening and lingered well into the morning, was the cause of the deaths. The fog in Dusk Hollow was different from any fog I had ever seen. It wasn't just a mist. It was thick, almost tangible, like a living thing. It would settle in the streets every night, creeping over the town like a blanket. People would avoid walking through it, fearing what might be lurking inside. Most of the time, the fog would dissipate by morning, but when it stayed too long, people began to worry. No one knew how long it had been around, but I had always felt uneasy around it. Something about the fog made the town feel wrong. By now, I was beginning to notice a pattern. Every time the fog rolled in, someone died, and it was always the same. The person would be found with that awful look on their face, their eyes wide open, as though they had seen something they could never forget. Each death had its own peculiarities. Some were in their homes, others in the streets, but all of them shared the same terrifying expression. I couldn't sit idly by any longer. I had to know the truth. I had to figure out what was happening to Dusk Hollow. One night, as the fog rolled in thicker than I had ever seen it before, I decided to investigate. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stepped out into the fog. I could barely see a foot in front of me, but I pushed forward, walking toward the woods at the edge of town. The fog seemed to swirl around me, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I kept walking, hoping to find some clue, some answer. And that's when I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. It was a voice, soft, almost too faint to hear, but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the old cemetery, a place that was rarely visited by anyone. There were rumors about the cemetery, that the graves of those long buried weren't quite as peaceful as they should be. I followed the sound, the fog thickening around me with every step. The cemetery loomed ahead, its gravestones barely visible through the haze. As I stepped into the yard, I saw something move in the distance. It was a shadow, just a flicker of movement, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I wasn't alone. And then I saw it, the source of the whisper, a figure standing by one of the graves. At first, I couldn't make out its features, but as I got closer, I realized it was an older man, hunched over, his face obscured by a hood. His hands were stretched toward one of the graves, as though he were offering something to the earth. I couldn't see what, but I could feel the presence of something dark and ancient in the air. The man turned, and in that moment, I saw his face. It was gaunt, His skin stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes were empty. Not just empty as in lifeless, but hollow, like there was nothing inside at all. "Leave this place," he whispered, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "You cannot undo what has been done." I froze, the blood in my veins running cold. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. The fog thickened, wrapping around me like a vice. "The fog," the man continued, his voice barely audible. "It feeds on fear. It feeds on the souls of those who wandered too far." Before I could react, he vanished into the mist, leaving me standing there, alone, terrified, and more confused than ever. But as I looked around, I saw something that made my heart stop. The graves in the cemetery, many of them had been disturbed. The earth was fresh, the dirt piled high in places where the dead had been unearthed. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the graves, but when I finally made my way back to town, the fog had cleared. It wasn't until the next morning, when I heard the latest news, that I realized just how deep the mystery went. The sheriff had found another body. This time, it was the town's youngest resident, a girl named Lily, just 14 years old. And like the others, her face was twisted in that horrible expression of fear. But what made this death even more chilling was the fact that Lily had been found in the cemetery. The same cemetery where I had just been hours before. I'm not sure how many more deaths Dusk Hollow will suffer before the truth comes to light. But one thing is certain. Whatever is happening here, it's tied to the fog, to the graveyard, and to the whispers that never stop. The town is cursed, and unless someone stops it, the fog will continue to claim more souls, one by one. And the people of Dusk Hollow will never be free again. My name is Mark. I grew up in Eastford, a small town that most people have never heard of. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the biggest event of the year is the Harvest Festival. We have a single street that cuts through the town like a ribbon, lined with old shops, houses that have seen better days, and a church that seems to have been there forever. People don't leave Eastford unless they have to, and most of the time, they don't come back. For the longest time, Eastford felt like a safe place to live, a quiet town, untouched by the chaos of the world outside. But things changed one summer when a series of mysterious deaths began to unsettle the peace of our town. It started with one death and then another, and before we knew it, a terrible pattern emerged. What I'm about to tell you is the truth. I wish I could say I'm making it up, but I can't. This is what happened in Eastford. It all started with Frank Thompson, the local butcher. Frank was well known in Eastford for his kindness and his skill with a cleaver. He had been running his butcher shop for over 30 years, and every morning, without fail, he would wave to me as I walked to school. He was a stout man with a loud laugh and a way of telling stories that always made you feel like you were right there with him, experiencing whatever wild adventure he was describing. One Thursday morning, Frank didn't show up at the butcher shop. At first, we all assumed he was just running late, but by noon, people started to get worried. His shop was always open by 6, and it wasn't like him to leave it unattended. When my mom heard about it, she went over to check on him, since she had been friends with Frank's wife, Eleanor, for years. When she arrived at his house, she found the door wide open. Frank's wife, Eleanor, was sitting on the porch, her face pale and blank. She didn't say anything when my mom approached her, just stared off into the distance as if in a daze. It wasn't until the sheriff arrived that we found out what had happened. Frank Thompson had been found dead in his shop, his body sprawled across the floor in an unnatural position. The cause of death was ruled as a heart attack, but the strange thing was that his body didn't look like he'd had a heart attack at all. His skin had turned a deep, bluish gray, and his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. But it was his mouth. His mouth was frozen in a grotesque grin. It was almost like he was trying to scream, but couldn't. The sheriff didn't have an explanation. The autopsy revealed no signs of trauma, no poisoning, no nothing. It was like his heart just stopped beating, and yet, the way his body was positioned, and the expression on his face, made it seem as though he had died from something far more sinister. At first, people thought it was just a freak occurrence, a heart attack brought on by stress or old age. But then, 2 weeks later, another death occurred. This time, it was Laura Mills, the librarian. Laura had lived in Eastford her entire life, and she was the kind of person everyone turned to for advice. She had a soft, gentle demeanor and always knew how to make you feel calm and welcome. She loved books, and the town's library was her pride and joy. She knew every book in there by heart and could recommend the perfect read for anyone who walked through the door. But one morning, the library was locked, and when the sheriff went to check on Laura, he found her body in the back room. She was sitting at her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her, but her eyes, just like Frank's, were wide open, frozen in terror. Her skin had taken on a grayish hue, and her mouth was twisted in a silent scream. The only difference between Laura's death and Frank's was that she had been holding a book, a thick, leather-bound book that looked old enough to have come from another time. The sheriff found no signs of foul play, no indication of what had caused her death. It was the same story again. No one knew what had happened to Laura, and no one could explain why she had died. But one thing was clear. Something was wrong in Eastford. The deaths didn't stop there. In the weeks that followed, more people in the town started to die. It was always the same. An expression of terror on their faces, their bodies stiff and unnatural, their mouths frozen in silent screams. First, it was Mr. Hargrove, the mechanic, found dead in his garage, his eyes wide open, his hands gripping a wrench like he had been trying to defend himself. Then it was Margaret, the local schoolteacher, found in her classroom, her body crumpled at her desk. Each death seemed more mysterious than the last, and the people of Eastford began to talk. They spoke in whispers, afraid to say anything too loudly. Some said the deaths were the result of a curse, that Eastford had angered something dark and ancient. Others said it was the work of ghosts, spirits of people long forgotten, returning to take revenge. And then there were those who whispered about the shadows, those strange, lurking figures that were said to be seen in the corners of people's eyes, just beyond the edge of vision. But no one had proof of anything. All we had were the bodies, the terror on their faces, and the feeling that something was horribly wrong in our town. I couldn't just sit by and let it happen. I had to know what was going on, and I couldn't let my town fall apart. One night, after the fog rolled in thicker than I had ever seen it, I decided to do something I had always been too afraid to do before. I went to the cemetery. It was an old cemetery, perched on a hill just outside town, with crumbling gravestones and moss-covered monuments. The fog clung to the trees, making everything seem distant and blurry. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I knew I had to see it for myself. As I walked through the cemetery, I noticed something odd. There were no sounds. The usual rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the sounds of the night, they were all gone. The only sound was my own breathing and the occasional creak of an old wooden fence. The fog seemed to be getting thicker the further I went in, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I came to a stop in front of an old grave, a large stone that was cracked and weathered with age. The name on it was barely legible, but I could make out the word Thorne. The Thorne family had been the founders of Eastford, or so the old stories went. It was said that they had been the wealthiest and most powerful family in town, but they had mysteriously disappeared generations ago, leaving only the grave markers behind. And then, I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows by the grave. It was tall, cloaked in black, its face hidden in the darkness. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't breathe. Before I could react, I heard a voice, a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my feet felt like they were cemented to the ground. The fog swirled around me, and the figure stepped forward, its face now visible. But it wasn't a face at all. It was a mask, an empty, hollow mask, like something you would find in a forgotten attic. "You're all doomed," the figure whispered, its voice low and raspy. "The curse of Eastford cannot be broken." The words sent a chill through my body, and before I knew what was happening, I turned and ran. The fog closed in behind me, and the cemetery seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't stop until I was back in town, my legs trembling with fear. The next morning, there was another death. This time, it was young Peter Carter, a boy no older than 12. He had been playing outside when he suddenly collapsed, his eyes wide open, his mouth twisted in the same silent scream that had marked all the other deaths. I don't know what's happening in Eastford, but I know one thing: it's not over. The deaths continue, and the shadows grow longer. The figure in the cemetery was right. We are all doomed. Whatever curse has been placed on this town is real, and it will take more lives before it is done. And now, every time I hear that whisper, I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me, too. Hollow Creek wasn't the sort of place that ever made the news. It wasn't large or exciting enough to be famous, but to the people who lived there, it was a close-knit community, a place where everyone knew everyone else. The town was surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides, with the creek running through the heart of it, winding lazily through the village. Most people in Hollow Creek had lived there their entire lives, and things had always seemed peaceful until the deaths began. I grew up in Hollow Creek, and for most of my life, it was exactly as you'd expect a small town to be: quiet, sleepy, and safe. There was the old general store, the school that had only a handful of students, and the occasional town meeting where everyone gathered in the church basement to discuss local matters. Life was slow, and for the most part, it was uneventful. But that all changed one cold October evening. It began with the disappearance of Edith Miller, a kind-hearted woman who had run the town's library for years. Edith was beloved by all, always offering a warm smile and a quiet word of encouragement. I remember visiting the library every day after school. It was a place where I could lose myself in books and escape the boredom of everyday life. Edith was always there, behind the counter, offering recommendations or simply chatting about the weather. One evening, I stopped by the library after my shift at the diner. The sun had long since set, and the streets were unusually empty. I pushed open the door to the library, but something didn't feel right. The usual comforting smell of old books and dust was missing. The lights were flickering in a way that made my skin crawl. I called out for Edith, but there was no answer. I went around to the back of the building, where the staff entrance was. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint glow of a light inside. As I stepped through the door, I noticed that the back hallway was dark, the air thick and cold. There was a strange smell in the air, something sharp and metallic. And then I found her. Edith was lying on the floor of her office, her body twisted in an unnatural position. Her arms were stiff, and her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling in shock. Her mouth was open, but no sound came from her. Her face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. I felt my stomach drop, and my heart raced in my chest. I called out for help, and within moments, the sheriff and a few other townspeople arrived. The scene was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of what had caused her death. The coroner concluded that Edith had died from what appeared to be a heart attack, though no one could explain the strange, frightened expression on her face. The entire town was shaken, but we tried to move on. We held a small memorial for Edith, and the library was closed for a few days. But no one could forget the look on her face. It haunted us all. The next death came just a few weeks later, and it was even more disturbing. It was Walter Grant, a local farmer who lived just outside of town. Walter was a man in his late 60s, known for his hard work and quiet demeanor. He kept to himself mostly, but he had been a part of the community for decades. He was the first to show up whenever there was a problem with the town's crops, and he always helped anyone who needed it. When I heard that Walter had been found dead, I didn't think much of it at first. Old age, perhaps, illness, but when I learned the details, my blood ran cold. Walter had been found in his barn, his body lying next to a pile of hay. Just like Edith, his eyes were wide open, and his mouth was frozen in that same horrifying scream. His hands were clenched into fists, as if he had been fighting something invisible. But there was something more disturbing. The barn had been completely undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of what could have caused Walter's sudden death. The sheriff's office ruled it as another heart attack, but everyone in town knew that something wasn't right. The deaths, the frozen expressions, the complete lack of any reasonable explanation. It was all too much to ignore. As the months went by, more deaths followed. Each one was eerily similar. A sudden death with no clear cause, the victim's body twisted in an unnatural way, their eyes wide open, and their faces frozen in an expression of fear. It wasn't just the elderly either. The youngest victim was Sarah Blake, a high school student who had been found dead in her bed, her face locked in a silent scream. The town became paranoid. People started locking their doors at night, avoiding the dark corners of town, and whispering about curses and dark forces. Everyone feared the same thing. Who would be next? I couldn't sit around and do nothing. I had to know what was happening. So, one night, I decided to investigate. I gathered a few of my closest friends, Ellen, a brave woman who worked at the local diner, and Jake, a boy I had grown up with who had always been good at figuring things out. Together, we set off toward the edge of town, where the old abandoned mill stood. It was a place the townspeople avoided, and for good reason. There were stories of strange happenings there. Disappearances, strange noises in the night, and the occasional flicker of light seen through the broken windows. We reached the mill just as the sun set, and the air grew thick with fog. The place was eerily silent, and the only sound was the distant rush of water from the creek. We pushed open the rusted door and stepped inside. The air inside the mill was damp, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. The place was filled with old machinery, covered in dust and cobwebs. It was abandoned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every step I took seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls and amplifying the fear building in my chest. We made our way toward the back of the mill, where there was an old storage room. The door creaked open, and we entered, only to find something that none of us could explain. There, in the center of the room, was an old wooden table, and on it were strange symbols, drawn in what looked like blood. They were arranged in a circular pattern, and at the center of the circle was a large, cracked mirror. The glass was dark, almost as if something had been painted over it, and it gave off an eerie glow. Jake stepped forward, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What is this place?" he whispered. Before I could answer, a cold wind blew through the room, slamming the door shut behind us. We all jumped, and I turned to see the mirror shift. The dark glass seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Then, I saw it. Figures in the mirror. Shadowy shapes that seemed to move just beyond the glass, their forms flickering like shadows in the dark. I couldn't tell if they were real or just a trick of the light, but I could feel their eyes, cold, watching. Ellen screamed, and I turned to find her backing away from the mirror. "We need to leave. Now." But before we could move, the shadows in the mirror seemed to stretch out, reaching toward us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Something was pulling me toward the mirror, an invisible force that I couldn't escape. Suddenly, the door burst open, and we all stumbled outside, gasping for air. The chill in the air seemed to lift, and the fog began to clear. We didn't speak as we hurried back to town, each of us shaken to our core. The next day, I learned something that chilled me to my very bones. The mirror from the mill had once belonged to the Miller family, the same family that had mysteriously disappeared from Hollow Creek over 50 years ago. Rumor had it that they had dabbled in dark rituals, trying to communicate with something beyond this world. No one knew exactly what had happened, but it was said that they had vanished without a trace, leaving only the mirror behind. Now, I think I know the truth. The mirror wasn't just a relic. It was a gateway, a doorway to something dark and ancient. And the deaths in Hollow Creek were no accident. The spirits of the Miller family, and whatever else they had summoned, were claiming the souls of anyone who dared to come too close. And I fear that, someday, they will come for me too. I grew up in a town called Hollow Springs. It's not on any map, not that you'd want to go there anyway. People from nearby towns don't even mention it. They talk about the nearby woods, the nearby river, and other places, but never Hollow Springs. They've forgotten about it, and maybe that's for the best. I wish I could forget too, but the memories keep coming back. The people who died, the things we saw, and the whispering shadows that still haunt my dreams. My name is Thomas, and what I'm about to tell you is the truth. It all started in the spring of 2007 when a stranger came to town. His name was James, though no one really knew much about him. He was a tall man with shaggy brown hair and a weathered face, like someone who had spent too much time on the road. James came into Hollow Springs, asking for work, and the town, being as small and isolated as it was, didn't have much to offer. But they did have a local inn that had been sitting empty for years, and the owner, Mrs. Greaves, decided to give James a place to stay. The inn was an old building, dating back to the 1800s. It creaked and groaned with every wind, and the floors always smelled like mildew. But James didn't mind. He spent most of his time in his room, and no one saw him much during the day. He would wander around the town at night, just walking the streets, staring into the windows of houses like he was looking for something. It didn't take long before people started to feel uneasy about him. The first death happened 3 weeks after James arrived. Martha Cartwright was an old woman who lived alone in a small cottage on the edge of town. She had been a widow for years and was known for her garden, which she tended to every day. Everyone in town knew Martha. She was one of the few people who remembered the history of Hollow Springs, the old stories, and the families that had lived there before. One morning, Martha's garden was found completely destroyed, her flowers trampled, the soil churned up as though something had dug through it. At first, people thought it was an animal, but then they found her body. She was lying in the middle of her garden, her eyes wide open, her body stiff. The expression on her face was one of pure horror, as though she had seen something that had terrified her to the core. The sheriff ruled it an accident, maybe a fall, or perhaps a heart attack brought on by the shock of seeing her garden ruined. But no one believed that. The way she looked, the fear in her eyes, it was something else entirely. It didn't take long for rumors to spread, and soon the whole town was whispering about James. Some said he was cursed, others believed he was a part of something dark, something that had come to Hollow Springs to claim the town for itself. The sheriff didn't listen to any of it. He just kept saying it was an accident. But people started to lock their doors at night. People started to stay indoors. Then, a month later, another death. This time it was Henry Fields, the blacksmith. Henry was a strong man, one of the toughest in town. He had a booming voice and a thick beard that gave him a tough look. He had been working late one evening, hammering out a new set of horseshoes when someone, no one knows who, heard him scream. They ran to his shop, only to find the door locked. When they broke it down, they found Henry standing in the middle of the room, his face twisted in agony, his body frozen like stone. His hand was still gripping the hammer, but his arm was unnaturally bent at the elbow, like something had forced it. His mouth was open in a silent scream, and his eyes were wide with terror. The town was shaken. 2 deaths in a month, both strange, both unexplained. And then the whispers grew louder. People began to talk about the old curse, the one that had supposedly been placed on the town centuries ago. Some believed it was the work of vengeful spirits. Others thought it was something worse, something that had been unleashed when James arrived. I didn't believe in curses. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. But I was starting to wonder if there was something to the rumors. The deaths, the fear in the eyes of the victims. It was all too much to ignore. So, I decided to do something that no one else in town was brave enough to do. I went to the inn to speak with James. The inn was eerily quiet when I arrived. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was oppressive. I called out to James, but there was no answer. I walked through the narrow hallways, passing rooms with doors that were slightly ajar. The whole place felt abandoned, even though it was clear someone was staying there. I found James in the parlor, sitting in front of the fireplace, staring into the flames. His eyes flickered up when I entered, but he didn't speak. "You're the new guy, right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "James, isn't it?" He nodded, but didn't say anything. "I wanted to ask you about something," I continued, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "People have been dying around here. Martha Cartwright, Henry Fields, and I was wondering if you knew anything about it." James didn't answer right away. He just kept staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and calm. "The town's cursed. It's been cursed for generations. And now, it's coming for all of you." I laughed, though it was hollow. Cursed? What do you mean by that? James turned to me, his eyes sharp, like daggers. This town has been forgotten for a reason. It was built on blood and sacrifice, and the souls that were lost here never left. They've been waiting for someone to come, someone who could awaken them, and now you're all going to die because of it. His words sent a chill through me, but I tried to brush it off. What are you talking about? Why are people dying? James didn't answer at first. He just stood up, walking toward the window. He stared out at the town, his face darkening. They're angry, he said quietly. The spirits are angry, and when they come for you, there's no escape. I didn't know what to make of it. Was he crazy? Or was there something more to his words? But before I could ask anything else, James turned to me, his face serious now. Leave this town. Don't wait for the next death. I didn't need any more warning. I left the inn that night, feeling a sense of dread settle over me. The next day, I packed my things and left Hollow Springs. I couldn't stay there anymore. The death toll was rising, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that James was right. Something terrible was coming for the town. Something old, something powerful. As I left Hollow Springs behind, I looked back at the town one last time. The fog was thick in the distance, curling around the buildings like it was alive. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was being watched. I never went back to Hollow Springs, and to this day, I've never heard anything about it again. The town simply disappeared. Some say it was wiped off the map by a terrible storm. Others say it was the curse that James warned about, claiming the rest of the souls who stayed behind. Whatever the truth is, I know one thing for sure. The people of Hollow Springs will never be forgotten. Not by me. Not by anyone who knew the horror that came with the death of that town. And every night, when I close my eyes, I hear the faint whispers of the spirits, calling me back to where it all began. I grew up in a small town called Mill Hollow, and the strange events that unfolded there still haunt me to this day. It's a quiet little place, nestled between thick woods and rolling hills. There's an old mill at the center of town, where the creek runs through and powers the old machinery. The town's history goes way back, so far that most people have forgotten it. But sometimes, some things shouldn't be forgotten. You see, the death started just after I moved there with my family. We'd come from a busy city looking for peace, thinking the countryside would give us a fresh start. Mill Hollow was small, too small, perhaps, but it seemed perfect. The town was quaint, with old houses and cobblestone streets. People waved as they walked past each other, and there was always a quiet hum in the air, like everything was in its right place. But beneath the calm, something terrible was happening, something no one wanted to talk about. I had only just turned 16 when we moved there. My parents didn't pay much attention to the warnings I heard from the locals. They'd tell me about strange occurrences, unexplained noises, and the occasional accident that seemed to happen at the old mill. But my parents shrugged it off. They were just stories, right? It was a few weeks into our stay when the first death occurred. We were having dinner in the kitchen when we heard sirens wailing in the distance. The sound sent a chill down my spine, but I figured it was just another car crash or fire. It wasn't until the next morning when I learned the truth. Old Tom, the man who ran the local bakery, was found dead. His body was discovered in the woods just beyond the mill, lying in a patch of tall grass. His death didn't make any sense. He was healthy, active, and in his late 50s. No reason for him to just drop dead. At first, the sheriff said it was a heart attack, but something didn't sit right with the townspeople. Old Tom had been a fixture in the town, always there in the morning, baking bread and offering a smile. But that morning, he wasn't there. They found him in the woods alone, with his hands clenched as if he'd been gripping something tight. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, and there was a strange, almost terrified expression frozen on his face. It didn't take long for people to start whispering about the mill. Everyone in Mill Hollow knew that the old mill had a history. It was abandoned years ago, but there were rumors about the place. Some said it was haunted by the spirits of the workers who had died there decades ago in an accident. Others believed there was something far darker at play, something tied to the creek that ran beneath it. But no one ever talked about it openly. It was like a secret, a deep, dark secret that the town had buried. The sheriff wrote it off as an accident, but I knew something wasn't right. That same night, I decided to go down to the mill with my friend, Danny. He had been born in Mill Hollow, and he knew all the old stories. He was convinced that something about the mill had caused old Tom's death. He wasn't the superstitious type, but even he couldn't deny the strange events that surrounded the place. We snuck out after midnight, the streets empty and silent as we made our way down the path toward the mill. The air was cold, the night darker than usual, and the trees seemed to loom over us like silent sentinels. When we reached the mill, the sound of the creek rushing through the woods was the only thing we could hear. The building itself was eerie, its windows boarded up and the wood rotting from years of neglect. Danny pushed open the rusty gate, and we stepped inside. The smell of mildew and decay was thick in the air. We could see the old wooden beams creaking in the wind, and the floor was covered in layers of dust. The mill had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, but as we explored the place, something felt off, like we weren't alone. It wasn't until we reached the lower levels, near the creek, that we found it. There, in the back room, we saw an old wooden chest, buried beneath a pile of debris. It was strange. Why would there be a chest down here? There was no sign that anyone had been down here in years. Danny, being the more daring one, decided to open it. When he did, the air around us seemed to change. The temperature dropped, and I could feel something shift in the atmosphere. Inside the chest, we found old papers, a few rusty tools, and what looked like an old diary. Danny began flipping through the pages, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't meant to be there. I wanted to leave, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. That's when we heard it, a soft whisper coming from the shadows. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it grew louder. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, a low, eerie voice that seemed to echo from all around us. Danny looked up, his face pale. "We need to go. Now." We didn't need to be told twice. We ran out of the mill and didn't stop until we were safely back at my house. But something had changed. Danny was different. He didn't say much after that night, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He kept talking about the mill, about the voices, about the cold feeling that had taken over him when we were inside. The next few days were a blur. There were more deaths, one after the other. Mrs. Green, the elderly widow who lived down the street, was found in her home, her face twisted in terror. Then, a young couple who had recently moved to town disappeared without a trace. The sheriff was at a loss, and the people of Mill Hollow were beginning to panic. It was clear that something dark was happening, but no one had any answers. The townspeople began to grow nervous, and the whispers about the mill grew louder. Some believed that the deaths were the result of an old curse that had been placed on the town centuries ago. Others said that the mill itself was cursed, its machinery still running deep beneath the earth, drawing in those unlucky enough to come too close. I wasn't sure what to believe, but I knew that I had to find out more. I went to the library, hoping to find something in the old town records. After hours of searching, I came across an old map of Mill Hollow, one that showed the layout of the town before it had been settled. There, on the map, was a small symbol near the creek, something I had never seen before. I traced it with my finger and found that it matched a symbol from the diary we had found in the mill. The symbol was ancient, its meaning long forgotten, but as I read the journal, I discovered something terrifying. The mill had once been a place of sacrifice, a place where townspeople had given their lives to appease an ancient spirit that lived beneath the creek. The spirit was said to demand blood, and as long as the mill ran, the town would prosper. But the moment the mill stopped running, the spirit would awaken and claim the town in death. The mill had stopped running years ago, and the deaths had begun. Each death, each terrified expression on the victims' faces, was the spirit's mark. It was drawing its power from the fear and anguish of the town. I knew then that the only way to stop the deaths was to destroy the mill, destroy whatever dark force had been awakened. But I also knew that it wouldn't be that easy. That night, I gathered a few of my friends, Danny included, and we went back to the mill. This time, we came prepared. We had gasoline, torches, and anything else we could think of to destroy the cursed place. We found the old chest again, and after pouring gasoline over it, we set it alight. As the flames consumed the mill, I thought I saw something in the smoke, something dark and twisted, watching us. But by the time the fire had burned itself out, it was gone. The death stopped after that, but Mill Hollow was never the same. The people who remained were different. The town was quieter, the air heavier, and the memories of what had happened hung over us like a dark cloud. And I've never forgotten the look in old Tom's eyes, the fear, the terror. It was as though he had seen something that no one should ever see. Some say that the mill still stands in the woods, hidden by the trees, waiting for the day when it will rise again, drawing the next victim into its grasp. Others say that the spirit has moved on, leaving the town in peace. But as for me, I still hear the whispers sometimes, and I know, deep down, that the spirit of Mill Hollow is never truly gone. It's just waiting for the right moment to claim the town once more. I've always believed that small towns are where the real stories lie. Sure, big cities have their fair share of drama, but it's in the quiet corners of the world where the truly strange things happen. Riverbend was one of those places. Tucked along a meandering river, it was a peaceful town that everyone thought they knew. The sort of town where everyone knew everyone, and the biggest excitement was a summer fair or the occasional barn dance. But Riverbend was hiding something that would change my life forever. My name is Emily, and I was 17 when I moved to Riverbend with my family. We were looking for a fresh start, a slower pace of life. My father had recently taken a job as the town's new doctor, and we settled into a house on the edge of the town, right near the woods. I thought I'd found a perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of our old life. But in reality, I was about to enter something much darker than I could have imagined. The first few weeks were fine. I went to the local high school and made a few friends. We explored the woods, took walks by the river, and everything seemed picture perfect. It was the sort of place you'd see in a postcard, where the townsfolk were friendly and everything felt safe. But as time passed, I started to notice odd things. There were whispers that no one would speak about openly. The older people in town would avert their eyes when I asked about the history of Riverbend, and the younger kids would look nervous when I brought up certain subjects. The few times I tried to dig deeper, I got only half-hearted answers. Oh, it's nothing, just old stories, but something about the place didn't sit right with me. I could feel it, like there was a secret lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't until the first death occurred that I realized how serious it all was. It was a crisp fall morning when we heard the news. A young woman named Sarah Bennett had been found dead, just outside of town, near the woods. She had been in her early 20s, a quiet, kind person who worked at the local bookstore. Everyone was shocked. The sheriff's report said it was an accident, maybe a fall or some sort of animal attack. But no one believed that. No one believed that someone as careful and level-headed as Sarah would have just wandered into the woods and ended up dead. What made it worse was the way she was found. Sarah's body was discovered lying by the riverbank, her arms stretched out beside her, as though she had been reaching for something. Her face was serene, almost peaceful, but there was a strange redness around her neck. It wasn't bruising, but something darker. It was as if she had been choked, but with an unseen hand. The most chilling part, though, was that her eyes were wide open, staring into the river as if she had seen something before she died. The expression on her face was one of terror. At first, everyone was too stunned to speak. The death didn't seem to make any sense, and no one knew what to think. The townspeople gathered in hushed groups, whispering about it. Some of the older residents said that they had heard stories of strange things happening near the woods, but they refused to elaborate. Others hinted that it was the work of the shadows, a word that no one would define. The rumors spread like wildfire, and that's when I began to hear the name, the Riverbend Curse. People would whisper it when they thought no one was listening, but whenever I asked what it meant, they'd stop and look away. My curiosity grew with each passing day. It was as though the town was holding its breath, waiting for something worse to happen. And worse did happen. 2 weeks after Sarah's death, another body was found. This time, it was Mike Harris, the local school teacher. He had been found in his small cabin on the edge of town, a lifeless form slumped over his desk. At first, the sheriff thought it was a natural death, maybe a stroke or heart attack. But when the body was examined, the situation grew even more mysterious. Mike's face was frozen in a grimace, as if he had been in the middle of a scream before he died. And just like Sarah, his eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring at something no one could see. His hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The strangest part, though, was the marks on his arms, deep, scratch-like wounds, as if something had been dragging him. The sheriff ruled it as a heart attack, but the townspeople didn't buy it. Not for a second. By this time, rumors were running rampant. Some said it was the work of a wild animal, something that had been disturbed in the woods. Others whispered about a curse that had been placed on Riverbend long ago, a curse that would claim anyone who dared to live there. But it wasn't until the third death that I knew for sure that something was terribly wrong. This time, it was my father. He had been the town's new doctor for just over a month when he became the next victim. My mother and I had gone out of town for a few days, and when we came back, we found the house empty. There were no signs of a struggle. His car was parked in the driveway, but there was no sign of him. The door was unlocked, which was unusual. We went inside, calling for him. We found him in his study, lying slumped against his desk with a look of pure terror on his face. His eyes were wide open, just like the others, but it was his hands that haunted me most. They were clenched tightly, the skin stretched tight across his fingers, as if he had been holding onto something for dear life. But there was nothing in his hands. No sign of a struggle, no obvious injury. We called the sheriff immediately. This time, they took a closer look. The sheriff seemed more concerned than he had been with the others, and after the examination, he pulled me aside. He said something that sent a chill down my spine. "We think it might be connected to Sarah's death. The same signs are there. The marks around the neck, the open eyes, the clenched hands." But he didn't have any answers. No explanation, just more questions. I couldn't stay in Riverbend anymore. The fear had gotten to me. It was like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next person to die. Everyone was looking over their shoulders, and the whispers had grown louder. Some people were packing up, leaving the town entirely. Others, like my mother, just kept their heads down, praying it would all stop. But the worst part was the feeling that whatever was killing these people, whatever was responsible for this, wasn't done. It wasn't just a series of accidents. It was something deliberate, something that was out to get every single person in Riverbend. I decided to leave, to get out of that cursed town before it claimed me too. But as I packed up, I saw something strange, something that made me question everything I knew. On the edge of the woods, just before the trees started, there was a large stone, half buried beneath the ground. I had never noticed it before, but there it was, right in front of the small path leading to the river. The stone was covered in strange markings, symbols that looked ancient, worn down by time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I recognized the symbols from the stories I had heard about the Riverbend curse. It was then that I realized what had been happening to the people of Riverbend. They hadn't just died, they had been chosen. The curse was real, and it had been waiting, biding its time, until it was strong enough to claim the town once and for all. The river, the woods, the stone, it was all part of it. The curse had been set into motion long ago, and now it was finishing its work. I left Riverbend the next day. I couldn't stay any longer, and I didn't want to be the next person to fall victim to whatever force was behind the deaths. The town's still there, I guess, though I've never gone back. The people who stayed have mostly left, or they've disappeared. And I don't know if anyone else has ever uncovered the truth behind the Riverbend curse. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I hear whispers in the wind. They're faint, like a memory, but they're still there, calling me back to the place I ran from. And I know, deep down, that whatever haunted Riverbend is still waiting for the next person to stumble across it. The shadows of Riverbend are never far behind. When I think back on the time I spent in Greystone Hollow, I can hardly believe it happened at all. It feels like a nightmare that I can't wake up from, even though it's been years since I left that cursed town behind. My name is Kyle, and I was just a kid when my family moved to Greystone Hollow. We were looking for a change, a quieter, simpler life. But what we found was something far darker than we could have ever imagined. Greystone Hollow was the kind of small town that looked like it belonged in a picture book. Charming, with its old brick buildings, overgrown streets, and crooked houses. There was an old school at the heart of the town, and a thick forest stretched out on the outskirts, where few people ventured. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant sound of the creek that ran through the valley. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever changed. Or so we thought. We arrived in Greystone Hollow during the fall, when the leaves were turning gold and red. My father had taken a new job at a local factory, and my mother was thrilled about starting fresh in a quieter, more peaceful town. I wasn't thrilled, but I was young, only 15 at the time, and I didn't have much say in the matter. My younger sister, Emma, was excited, but I could already sense something was off about the place. At first, everything seemed fine. We moved into a modest house near the edge of town, just a short walk from the woods. The neighbors were friendly, and the town had a charm that I couldn't deny. I even made a few friends at the local school. But the longer we lived there, the more I began to notice strange things. There were the rumors, of course. Whenever I asked people about the history of Greystone Hollow, they would change the subject quickly. I heard bits and pieces from my classmates, mostly stories about the town's dark past. It was hard to get anyone to talk about it directly, but I pieced things together from the fragments I heard. Greystone Hollow had been settled by pioneers over 100 years ago, and it had seen its fair share of tragedy. The most well-known tale was about the disappearance of a group of settlers who had lived in a cabin deep in the woods. It was said that one night, they were all found dead, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. Some believed it was the work of bandits or wild animals. Others whispered that it was something more sinister, a curse placed on the town by the forest itself. Despite the dark tales, life went on in Greystone Hollow, and I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that crept over me every time I passed by the old woods. But then, just a few weeks after we moved there, a death occurred. It was Mrs. Larkin, an elderly woman who lived in a small cottage on the other side of town. She was a quiet, kind soul who rarely left her house, and I'd seen her only a handful of times. When I heard she had passed, it didn't seem strange. She was old, after all. But what shocked everyone was the way she died. Mrs. Larkin had been found in her home, sitting in her rocking chair by the window, just like she had every morning for the past few years. But when they found her, her body was stiff, her eyes wide open, and her face was frozen in a look of pure terror. It was as if she had died in the middle of seeing something horrible. The doctors said it was a stroke, but no one believed that explanation. Her death was just the beginning. In the following months, more deaths followed, each one more mysterious than the last. Mr. Hughes, the local grocer, was found dead in his store, his body twisted and contorted in ways that defied logic. The young couple, Sarah and Mark, who had recently moved to the town, were discovered in their home, their throats slit, their faces frozen in fear. The deaths were all different, yet they shared one horrifying commonality. The victims died with expressions of abject terror, their eyes wide open, their bodies frozen in strange positions. The town was gripped by fear. People started locking their doors at night, whispering about something that had been awakened in Greystone Hollow. Some spoke of a curse, others about a spirit or demon that roamed the woods, waiting to claim its next victim. I didn't know what to believe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening was real, and that it was coming for us. As the deaths continued, I began to notice more strange occurrences around the town. The air seemed heavier, like something was pressing down on us. Animals, once common in the area, seemed to vanish. The creek that ran through the valley, once clear and lively, began to run dark and murky, as if the life had been sucked out of it. The trees in the woods seemed to loom closer to the town, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. I could feel it. Something was wrong. It wasn't until the night of my 16th birthday that I realized the true horror of Greystone Hollow. That night, Emma and I had decided to take a walk along the edge of the woods, a place we had been warned to stay away from. But we were curious. We didn't believe in the old stories, or at least I didn't. But when we ventured into the woods, we felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the woods were alive, watching us, waiting. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the further we walked, the quieter it became. No animals, no wind, just an eerie stillness that chilled my bones. We came across an old stone wall, half buried beneath moss and vines, and as we approached, we saw something horrifying. The names. Carved into the stone were the names of the townspeople who had died, each one marked with a date. But there were more names than I had expected. They went back centuries, long before the town was officially founded. And next to each name was a symbol, a strange, twisting mark that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. As I touched the stone, I felt a coldness spread through my fingers, like I was touching something that didn't belong in this world. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural whisper echoing through the trees. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl and your heart race. Emma grabbed my arm, her face pale with fear. "Kyle, we need to go," she whispered. But before I could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was an old man, hunched and ragged, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He didn't speak, just stared at us with an intense, piercing gaze. Then, without warning, he disappeared into the darkness, as if he had never been there at all. We ran, terrified, back toward the town, but the feeling of being watched never left us. I couldn't shake the thought that the old man, if he was even real, had been trying to warn us. The next morning, we heard the worst news yet. My father, who had been working late at the factory, was found dead in his office. His body was twisted unnaturally, his face frozen in fear. The sheriff said it was a heart attack, but we all knew better. The fear in his eyes was undeniable. After that, we left Greystone Hollow. We packed up and left in the middle of the night, without even saying goodbye to the few friends we had made. I couldn't bear to stay any longer in that cursed place, where the air was thick with fear and the shadows seemed to stretch out, waiting for the next soul to claim. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the town one last time. The mist had settled over the valley, and the woods loomed like a dark, silent giant. I knew that Greystone Hollow would never be the same, that something evil had taken root there, and no one who stayed would ever be the same again. To this day, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that Greystone Hollow is still waiting for me, that whatever dark force is out there in the woods is still watching, waiting for the next person to stumble upon its cursed ground. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispering wind, and I wonder if it's calling me back to the place I fled, to the town that never lets go. Greystone Hollow might be gone from my life, but it will never be gone from my nightmares. I've always been a skeptic. I never really believed in curses or ghosts or anything supernatural, but that was before I moved to Raven's End. It was the summer after my junior year when my parents decided we needed a change of scenery. My dad had a new job, and we found ourselves moving to a small town in the middle of nowhere, tucked between the mountains and the forest. Raven's End was a place I'd never heard of, and it felt like stepping back in time. The town itself was small, really small. It consisted of a single main street, a few old shops, and a general sense of isolation. I'd never seen a place so quiet, with the kind of silence that hangs heavy in the air, punctuated only by the wind or the distant hoot of an owl. The houses looked as if they had been carved out of the land decades ago, weathered and worn, surrounded by tall, dense trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The first few weeks in Raven's End were uneventful. My parents seemed happy with the move, and I did my best to settle into the routine of a new school. It wasn't easy, but I eventually made a few friends, and I started to feel like maybe I could get used to the quiet. But there was something off about Raven's End. It wasn't the kind of place that welcomed you with open arms. It was as though the town had a history, one that no one spoke about. I noticed that when I asked questions, people would exchange uneasy glances or mutter something vague about old stories before quickly changing the subject. It didn't take long before I became curious, and my curiosity led me to the local library. One afternoon, I decided to do some research. I went to the library, an old, musty place located at the far end of the main street. The building itself was draped in shadows, the shelves packed with books that had clearly been untouched for years. I made my way past the aisles, searching for any sign of history. That's when I found the old leather-bound journal. It was lying on a table near the back of the library, wedged between two books on local history. The cover was cracked and faded, and the pages inside were yellowed but still legible. As I picked it up, a chill ran down my spine. The journal was titled, "The Curse of Raven's End, A Tale of Sorrow." I hesitated for a moment, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. I hadn't expected to find anything, but the title piqued my interest. I opened the journal slowly, my fingers brushing against the delicate paper, and began to read. The first entry dated back nearly a century ago. It was written in the early 1900s, and it detailed a series of deaths that had plagued Raven's End. July 12, 1912. I still hear them, even when I'm alone. The screams are there, just at the edge of my hearing, like the wind itself. I found another one today, near the creek. It was poor old Mrs. Hollis. Her body was twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. Her eyes, they were wide open, staring at the sky, her face contorted in terror. The wounds on her neck, it looked as though something had choked her, but there were no marks on her skin to explain it. Sheriff Clausen insists it was an animal attack, but I know better. I closed the journal and stared at it, my eyes widening. Mrs. Hollis? I thought back to the whispers I'd heard in town, and the stories that people refused to talk about. It couldn't be a coincidence. I flipped back through the entries, finding other dates and names. There were at least a dozen entries, each one detailing a death that ended the same way. A look of sheer terror, eyes open, and a death that defied explanation. I flipped back to the most recent entries. There had been a death earlier that year, and it described a man named James Grayson, found in his workshop at the edge of town. His body had been contorted in a way that no one could replicate, and his eyes, those eyes, were open, staring into the darkness. I felt a coldness settling deep in my chest. Could it be true? Were people in Raven's End really dying under mysterious circumstances? The next day at school, I tried to ask some of my classmates about it, but the reaction was always the same. Faces would go pale, and their eyes darted away. It was as though I had brought up a forbidden subject. That night, I decided to investigate further. I snuck out of my house, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. I walked along the winding roads that led out of town, toward the forest. I knew the area well enough, and I had explored it with friends before. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, the trees became thicker, and the silence became almost deafening. It wasn't long before I felt like I was being watched. My heart pounded, and I could feel a chill seeping into my bones. I stopped and looked around, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the reach of my flashlight. As I shone the light into the gloom, I thought I saw movement, something small and shadowy darting behind the trees. I froze, gripping the flashlight tightly. My breath caught in my throat, and I began to back away slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had seen the movement. And that's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere nearby. My blood ran cold, and I turned and bolted, the branches slapping at my face and arms as I sprinted back toward the edge of the forest. When I reached the road, I was panting, and my eyes stung with tears. I stumbled back toward my house, feeling as though something had brushed past me in the dark. I burst through the front door, trembling, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My mom rushed into the foyer, her eyes widening when she saw me. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice frantic. I don't know," I stammered, trying to regain composure. I was walking near the woods, and something was out there. I heard it growling. My mother's eyes darkened, and she grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the kitchen. "Sit down now," she said firmly. As I sat at the table, she glanced nervously toward the window, her expression grim. She began to speak in a low voice. "I should have told you sooner, but I didn't want you to be scared." Tears welled in her eyes. "This town, it's cursed. People have been dying for generations, and no one knows why. The stories, people in Raven's End have seen things they can't explain. Eyes wide open, deaths that don't make sense. And the journal, it's not the first time they've tried to document it, but no one believes them." My heart pounded in my chest. "What do you mean? Why didn't anyone tell me?" She swallowed hard. "We tried to leave before, but we always ended up back here. Something keeps pulling us back. It's as though the curse is tied to this place, and it's relentless. I stared at her, my mind reeling. I began to think about all the deaths I had read about and the strange events I had experienced. The growl in the woods echoed in my ears, and I knew that I had to get out of Raven's End before it was too late. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't look back as I walked out the door. As I drove away, I glanced into my rearview mirror and saw the town disappearing in a haze of dust and fog. I never went back to Raven's End, and I never spoke about it again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers at the edge of my dreams, the growls, the screams, and the wide open eyes. And I wonder, are there places where the past refuses to die? Is there a curse that refuses to let go? Raven's End is still out there, somewhere, waiting for its next victim. I just hope I'm not the one who returns. When I first heard about Hollow Creek, I was just a kid, around 14, and I didn't understand why anyone would ever want to move there. My dad had been transferred to a new job in a small town, and as typical for us, we packed up and made the move with little hesitation. My mom was excited about the change of scenery, and my younger brother, Ben, was already planning how he'd explore the forests around the town. But me? I wasn't so thrilled. I'd lived in the city my whole life, and this small, sleepy town seemed like it was stuck in a time warp. We drove for what felt like hours through winding country roads before we arrived at the town's limits. Hollow Creek wasn't much to look at. There were maybe 20 or 30 houses scattered across the town, along with a few small businesses that had clearly been around for generations. The place was surrounded by dense woods on all sides, with a creek that ran through the middle of it. The name Hollow Creek had a sinister ring to it, but I brushed it off as just the kind of spooky name small towns like this tended to have. The first few days were uneventful. We moved into a modest house on the edge of town, a bit farther out than I would have liked, but it was peaceful. There were no crowds, no city noise, just the occasional sound of birds or rustling leaves. It was a change, but it wasn't a bad one. That is, until I started to hear the stories. It all began when I met Ethan, a local boy around my age. He was one of the first people to introduce himself when I started school, and he was friendly enough, though there was always something a little off about him. He had a certain unease in his eyes, as though he was constantly on edge, like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. "You're new around here, huh?" Ethan asked me one afternoon as we walked to class together. "I'll bet you're already hearing the stories." "What stories?" I asked, genuinely curious. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You know, about the deaths. People around here don't talk about it much, but if you dig deep enough, you'll start to hear about them. People die around here, strange deaths, the kind that don't make sense." My heart skipped a beat. Deaths? What was he talking about? Ethan seemed to sense my confusion and quickly added, "Don't worry about it. It's just old stuff. Doesn't happen anymore." But as I later learned, the deaths he mentioned weren't old stuff. They were recent, and they were the kind of deaths that you couldn't just explain away. It all started with Mrs. Harris, the elderly woman who lived down the street from us. She had lived in Hollow Creek her entire life and was known for her grumpy, no-nonsense attitude. No one thought much of her death when it happened one cold October night. The news said it was a natural cause, a stroke perhaps. She was old, after all, but when the funeral came, there was something strange about it. People said that when they found her, her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. Her fingers were curled into fists, like she was holding onto something, or trying to escape from something. Then there was George Tanner, a man who worked at the local gas station. He was a quiet man, a bit of a loner, but always polite. He was found one morning, sitting in his car with the engine running. He didn't look like he had been in any pain, just peacefully staring ahead. But when they tried to pull him out of the car, they found that his body was stiff, as though he had been frozen in place. The strange part was that the interior of the car was unnaturally cold, even though it had been a warm day. Rumors spread quickly after George's death. Some said he had been seeing things in the woods near the creek. Others claimed he had gotten too close to something dangerous that had been hiding in those woods for generations. People began to talk about the shadows. I didn't know much about the shadows at first, but when I started asking around, I realized that they were the heart of the town's dark history. There were tales of people vanishing into the woods, never to be seen again. Some had been found, their bodies twisted and broken in ways that made no sense. Others had simply disappeared, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The people who died in the woods often had similar symptoms to the ones I had heard about: wide eyes, clenched fists, and an expression of terror that would haunt anyone who saw them. Ethan told me that the first death happened nearly 50 years ago, when a family of 4 had moved to Hollow Creek. The father had been a local historian, someone who was obsessed with uncovering the town's past. One night, he ventured into the woods, convinced that he could uncover the truth behind the mysterious disappearances. The next morning, his wife and children found him by the creek, his body horribly contorted, his mouth open in a silent scream. His wife had gone mad shortly after and was eventually found dead in a similar way. The children? They disappeared, and no one ever heard from them again. I wanted to believe these stories were just that, stories. But then, strange things started happening. I woke up one night to the sound of footsteps outside my window. It was a soft, shuffling noise, like someone was walking along the edge of the house. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered through the blinds. The moonlight illuminated the yard, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing by the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. I thought it must have been my imagination or the wind playing tricks on me. The next day, though, I wasn't so sure. Ben had been talking about the same thing. He had heard footsteps too, and he mentioned seeing a shadow in the window. Then, it got worse. I was walking home from school one afternoon when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing at the edge of the creek, was a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but something was wrong. The figure was all shadow, like it was made of darkness itself. The figure stood still, staring at me with empty, hollow eyes. It didn't move, it just watched. I took a step back, feeling the urge to run, but something in me made me stop. I couldn't look away, and then, in a blink, the figure was gone. No footsteps, no rustling in the leaves, just a complete and utter silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What was it that I had seen? Was it just my imagination? Or was something truly wrong with the town? I had to know. The next day, I convinced Ethan to come with me. We took a hike into the woods, toward the creek. We didn't speak much as we walked, but I could tell that Ethan was nervous. I asked him why, but he just shook his head and muttered, "You're better off not knowing, trust me." When we reached the creek, I felt the same chill I had felt the night before. The air seemed colder here, as though something was watching us. And then I saw it, a shape, moving between the trees. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling, "do you see that?" Ethan was frozen. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave, now." But it was too late. The figure was upon us, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare. It wasn't a man. It was something else, something that existed in the darkness, its form shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. It was as though the very air around it bent and distorted, trying to shield us from seeing what it truly was. Before we could run, the figure's voice cut through the air, a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "You shouldn't have come." Then, everything went black. I don't remember what happened next, but when I woke up, I was lying on the ground by the creek. Ethan was beside me, shaking, his eyes wide with terror. We didn't say anything to each other, but we both knew something had changed. The town, the woods, and the figure. It was all connected in a way we didn't understand. We left Hollow Creek that same night, without a word to anyone. We packed our things, and we never returned. To this day, I don't know what happened in those woods or what kind of creature I saw that day. But I do know this: Hollow Creek is not a place for outsiders, and the shadows that haunt it are not just stories, they're real. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers of Hollow Creek calling me back. Briar Hill is the kind of town that feels like it's suspended in time. Nestled deep in the hills, it's a place that doesn't appear on many maps. A town with fewer than 500 people, and fewer still who actually speak of it in a way that makes sense. For years, I'd heard my family mention it in passing, like it was some forgotten chapter in the past, but never did I think we'd end up living there. But when my dad lost his job and needed a fresh start, we packed up and made the drive, not knowing that the change we were hoping for would come at a much darker cost. Briar Hill was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and there was an unspoken rule that you didn't ask too many questions. The streets were narrow and lined with old, creaky houses, each one with their own secrets buried in the walls. The people who lived there were kind enough, but there was something off about them. They always looked over their shoulders when they spoke to us, as though the truth was something they couldn't share, something that they were afraid of. When we first moved into our new house, I thought I'd be fine. I was in my senior year of high school, and I just wanted to survive the last few months without making waves. But it wasn't long before I began hearing whispers about the town's past, and those whispers led me to things I wish I could forget. It all started when I met Clara. Clara was one of the first people I met at Briar Hill High. She was quiet, with long, dark hair and pale skin. Her eyes were always downcast, like she was lost in thought, as if there was some weight pressing down on her that no one could see. We sat together in the cafeteria one day, and she told me about the history of the town. "Do you know about the deaths?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Clara looked around nervously, as though she was afraid someone might hear us. "People die here, in strange ways. It's happened for generations." I leaned in closer, but before I could ask anything more, a teacher walked past, and Clara quickly changed the subject. I didn't press her further. At the time, I thought she was just another one of those odd people who made up stories to feel special. But as the days went on, I began hearing the same thing from others, whispers of death, of people who had vanished or died under mysterious circumstances. I brushed it off at first, but soon I couldn't ignore it. The first strange death I heard about was that of Ethan Turner. Ethan was a local boy, a few years older than me, who had been found dead in his bedroom one cold October morning. The story that circulated was that he had been found sitting upright on his bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the wall. The room had been completely still, not a single thing out of place. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, no explanation for what had happened. It was like Ethan had simply died in the middle of doing something, as though time had frozen around him. At first, the police didn't know what to make of it. They speculated it could have been a heart attack, but Ethan was young, healthy, and in perfect shape. There was no logical reason for it. But the strangest part? His body was found with his hands clenched tightly into fists, as though he was holding onto something invisible, something that no one could see. After Ethan's death, other strange deaths followed. One by one, people in Briar Hill started dying under similar circumstances. The elderly woman, Mrs. Dawson, was found in her rocking chair, staring out the window, her body frozen in place like she was watching something just beyond her reach. A teenage girl, Lily, who lived down the street, was found dead in her bed, her expression full of terror, her fingers locked around the bedspread as though she had been fighting something invisible. The most chilling part of these deaths was the fact that no one could explain them. The authorities were baffled, but the townspeople, they all had their theories that no one dared to speak aloud. It was as if they knew something was lurking in Briar Hill, something dark and old, and the deaths were just the beginning. One evening, after hearing more whispers and strange stories from the locals, I decided to do some digging. I had to know what was going on. So, I went to the town library. The library was old and dusty, the kind of place that smelled like history, where the floors creaked and the shelves were weighed down with decades of forgotten books. I wandered through the aisles, my fingers grazing the spines of books on local history, hoping to find something that could explain what had been happening. That's when I found it. Hidden in the back corner of the library, tucked away behind stacks of old, yellowed newspapers, was a journal. It was bound in leather, its pages cracked and brittle from age. The journal belonged to a man named Samuel Harris, and it was dated back to 1923. I opened it carefully, the pages falling open to a passage that caught my eye. The Curse of Briar Hill. It was a simple title, but the words that followed sent a chill through me. I have lived in this town my whole life, and I've seen things that no one would believe. The deaths are not random. They are part of something older than anyone in Briar Hill understands. There is something in these hills, something ancient, something that demands a price. And every time it takes a life, it grows stronger. I read further, my heart racing as the journal described a long history of death and disappearances in Briar Hill. It spoke of a curse that had been placed on the town generations ago, a curse that had been passed down from one century to the next. It told of a ritual, one that had been performed long ago to keep the darkness at bay, but the ritual had failed, and now the town was trapped in an endless cycle of death. The journal mentioned a figure, a shadow that roamed the town at night, appearing only when the time was right. This shadow was said to be the manifestation of the curse itself, feeding on fear and sorrow. It would choose its victims carefully, watching them from the darkness until the moment arrived when they were taken. It didn't matter who you were, young, old, rich, or poor. If you were chosen, there was no escaping it. As I read, the air around me seemed to grow colder. I could hear a faint noise in the distance, like a soft whisper, but when I looked around, there was no one there. I closed the journal quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I had uncovered something I wasn't supposed to know, something that had been buried for a reason. The next day, I went to Clara, desperate for answers. She had to know something. "You've been asking about the deaths, haven't you?" she said when I approached her in the schoolyard, her voice low and strained. "You shouldn't have. You don't understand what's happening here. You don't know what you're dealing with." I begged her to explain, but Clara just shook her head. "It's too late," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "The curse is already in motion. Once it starts, it never stops. No one who tries to stop it ever survives." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my bed, my mind racing. I thought I saw something move in the corner of my room, a shadow that shifted and twisted as though it was alive. I kept hearing strange noises, scratching sounds, whispers, like something was moving just out of sight. And then, I heard it, a soft voice, calling my name from the darkness. "Come to me, Olivia." My blood ran cold. It wasn't my name. It was something else. I could feel it creeping closer, the darkness pressing in on me. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. But when I turned on the light, the room was empty. The next morning, Clara was gone. No one knew where she went, and no one spoke of her disappearance. It was as if she had never existed. But I knew. The curse had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others before her. Briar Hill is a town that keeps its secrets well hidden. But sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the whispers of the past, of the deaths, of the curse, and of the shadow that waits in the darkness, ready to take its next victim. I left Briar Hill after that, but sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I still hear the whispers calling me back. Pine Hollow wasn't the kind of town you'd visit for vacation. It was small, quiet, and seemed to lack any real charm. Tucked away in the remote hills, it felt like a place that time had forgotten. I was 16 when my family moved there, and even though I didn't have much choice, I hated it from the moment we arrived. My dad had taken a job at a local factory, and my mom, trying to make the best of things, was already envisioning this as a fresh start for our family. But for me, Pine Hollow felt like the end of the world. It wasn't just the isolation that bothered me. It was the air of sadness that hung over the town. People spoke in whispers when they thought no one was listening, and there was always this feeling that something wasn't quite right. The town had only a few hundred residents, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, but they didn't seem to want to talk about the past, especially the deaths. I first started hearing about them when I made friends with Sarah, a girl in my class. She was one of those people who always seemed to know what was going on in town, and she was quick to fill me in on the strange happenings around Pine Hollow. "Do you know about the Hollow Street deaths?" she asked me one afternoon as we sat together in the cafeteria. I stared at her. "What do you mean, the Hollow Street deaths?" Sarah glanced around before lowering her voice. "You won't hear it from the adults, but there's a history of people dying on that street. It's been happening for generations." I wasn't sure if Sarah was just telling tall tales, but her serious tone made me uneasy. So, I asked her to tell me more. The first one happened in the 1800s, she explained, when a family of four moved into an old house at the end of the street. The father, John Ferguson, was a logger, and they say he was a hard man. One winter, he came down with a fever, and while he was bedridden, his wife, Martha, started hearing strange noises at night. Scratching sounds, whispers, like something was calling to her. They thought it was just the wind, but one night, when John was too weak to leave the bed, Martha went to investigate. She found a shadowy figure standing by their front door. The figure was dark, almost like smoke, and it didn't speak. But when Martha got too close, it reached out and touched her. She screamed, and John came running. But by the time he got there, she was gone. The figure disappeared, and all they found were her clothes, left behind in a pile. I frowned. That sounds like a ghost story. Are you telling me this is true? Sarah nodded, her expression grim. It gets worse. The next night, John went missing, too. They found his body in the woods, far from the house, his eyes wide open, his mouth frozen in a scream. They never figured out what happened to him. The house was abandoned after that. That's crazy, I said, trying to convince myself that it was just a story. Sarah didn't stop there. It happened again. Over the years, people who moved into that house started dying. Some say it's cursed, others think it's something worse. The last death was a couple of months ago. I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah wasn't making this up. There was something about the way she spoke that made the story sound too real. Pine Hollow was the kind of place where strange things happened. But even so, I didn't expect what came next. A week after my conversation with Sarah, I began to notice that the residents of Pine Hollow were acting even stranger than usual. People kept to themselves more, avoiding eye contact when I walked past them on the street. I caught a few of them whispering behind their hands when I passed, but whenever I tried to ask what was going on, they'd either change the subject or offer me nervous smiles. It wasn't until I was walking home one afternoon, passing through Hollow Street, that I saw something that made my blood run cold. At first, it was just a flicker, like a shadow moving quickly across the road in the corner of my eye. I turned my head, and there, standing at the far end of the street, was a figure. It was tall, darker than the shadows around it, almost like a void that swallowed all the light. I could barely make out its shape, but its eyes, they glowed, just a faint red light that seemed to pierce the darkness. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My instinct was to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The figure's gaze was fixed on me, and I could feel it, like it was pulling me toward it. For a moment, I thought I might be dreaming or imagining things, but then I blinked, and the figure was gone, vanished into thin air. I didn't know what to think. Was it a trick of the light? Or was there really something out there, something connected to the death Sarah had told me about? The next day, I decided to go to the local library and look up more about the Hollow Street deaths. It wasn't easy to find information. Most of the old records were tucked away in dusty archives, and the librarian was strangely unhelpful, almost like she didn't want anyone asking too many questions. But after hours of searching, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. A small newspaper article from 1934 detailed the deaths of a family who had moved into the house on Hollow Street. The family was last seen on a Sunday afternoon, and by the time the neighbors noticed they were missing, it was too late. The article mentioned that the house had been searched, but there was no sign of the family, except for a trail of strange symbols carved into the walls. The bodies were found a week later, dumped in the woods, their faces twisted in terror. The police had no explanation for what happened, but the townspeople whispered about the curse of Hollow Street, saying that the spirits of those who had died there were restless and angry. I couldn't shake the thought that the figure I had seen the other day might be connected to these deaths. It was like something was watching over the street, something that fed off the fear of the people who lived there. That night, I decided to take a walk down Hollow Street to see if I could find any more clues. The air was thick with fog, and the street lamps flickered as I walked past the old houses, each one dark and silent. I reached the end of the street where the abandoned house stood, the one that had been vacant for decades. It looked even more menacing in the pale moonlight, the windows boarded up, the roof caving in on one side. I walked closer, my heart racing. As I passed the house, I heard something, a faint rustling noise, like someone was moving inside. My curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the house, pushing aside the overgrown weeds that had overtaken the yard. I tried the door. It was unlocked. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a chill in the air. The smell of decay and mildew hit me immediately, but it wasn't just the old house that made the air feel heavy. It was the sense that something was watching me. I moved through the darkened rooms, the floor creaking beneath my feet as I explored, feeling a strange pull toward the back of the house. When I reached the kitchen, I saw it. The same symbols from the article, carved into the walls. But this time, they weren't just markings, they were fresh. And underneath them, etched into the floorboards, was a name. Martha Ferguson. I froze. The name was the same as the woman from the story Sarah had told me. Was this the house where it all began? The place where the curse had taken root? Suddenly, I heard it. The same whispering voices I had heard the day before. They were low, almost unintelligible, but they were getting louder. My skin prickled and I spun around, but there was no one there. The temperature dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath in the air. Then, from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. It was the same shadow I had seen before, the one with glowing red eyes. This time, it was closer. I could hear it whispering my name, its voice deep and guttural, filled with an inhuman hunger. "Come closer," it said, its voice wrapping around me like a vice. I backed away, but my feet wouldn't move. My heart raced as I tried to force myself to run, but I was paralyzed, unable to break free from the grip of the figure's gaze. It took a step forward, its form shifting and swirling in the darkness. I could hear it laughing, a sound that made my blood run cold. But just as it reached for me, the door slammed open, and I was yanked out of the house by someone strong. Someone who knew exactly what was happening. It was Sarah. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her face pale with fear. "It's too late. Once it sees you, you're marked." We ran, and as we reached the edge of Hollow Street, I dared to look back. The figure was still there, watching us from the shadows, its eyes glowing brighter than ever. That night, I didn't sleep. Pine Hollow wasn't just a town. It was a trap. And whatever had been lurking in those woods, whatever had caused the deaths over the generations, wasn't finished yet. It was still waiting, and it would never let go. I left Pine Hollow shortly after that, but I never forgot what I saw, or the warning Sarah gave me. Some places are cursed, and Pine Hollow was one of them. The curse wasn't just a story, it was alive, and it would claim anyone who dared to stay too long. Maple Creek was the kind of town that seemed like it belonged in a history book, located in the foothills of the mountains. It wasn't known for its size or its wealth. It had only about 300 residents, mostly families who had been living there for generations, and a few people who had moved in over the years, looking for a quiet life. But for all its quiet charm, there was something off about Maple Creek. I moved to Maple Creek with my family when I was 15. My father had accepted a job as the town's new sheriff, and we thought the change of pace would be good for us after the chaos of city life. At first, everything seemed peaceful. The streets were lined with old oak trees, and the houses were painted in soft pastels, each one unique but somehow fitting in with the others. Everyone knew everyone else, and they all greeted each other with a warmth that felt genuine. But beneath the friendly smiles and waving hands, something lingered in the air, something dark and unspoken. The first time I heard about the deaths in Maple Creek was during my first week in school. I was sitting in the lunchroom when I overheard two girls talking in hushed tones. They were whispering, trying to make sure no one else could hear, but I could catch every word. "Did you hear about the Carter family?" one of the girls asked, her voice shaking. The other girl nodded gravely. "Yeah, they found them all dead in their house last summer. No one knows what happened to them. It was like they just vanished. But their bodies were still there. They were all lying in their beds, just like they had gone to sleep. No signs of struggle. Nothing." I had just started to ask what they meant, but the first girl quickly looked around and said, "You don't want to know. Just don't ask about it." The conversation ended abruptly, and they both walked away, leaving me confused and unsettled. That was when I first began to notice how many people in Maple Creek seemed to avoid talking about certain things. Whenever someone brought up the subject of the Carter family, or any other mysterious death, the room would grow eerily quiet and the conversation would quickly change. I couldn't understand it. How could a whole town just pretend something didn't happen? Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked my father about the deaths. At first, he brushed me off with a vague answer about it being an unfortunate incident. But when I pressed him, I noticed something change in his expression. For a moment, his face became tight with tension, and I could see the shadow of worry in his eyes. "I don't know all the details, son," he said quietly, "but it was unusual. And it's not something I want you to get mixed up in." His tone made me pause. I didn't ask him any more questions, but the silence in his voice told me there was more to the story. I decided to look into it myself. I spent the next few weeks asking around town, trying to get anyone to talk to me about the Carter family. But every time, people either refused to speak about it or quickly changed the subject. Some people gave me nervous glances, as if they were afraid I'd uncover something they weren't meant to know. Finally, after weeks of asking, I managed to find an elderly woman named Mrs. Caldwell who had lived in Maple Creek for as long as anyone could remember. She was one of the few who hadn't left town in recent years. "I suppose you have a right to know, young man," Mrs. Caldwell said in a soft, trembling voice when I asked her about the Carter family. "But you won't like it. It's something that's haunted this town for a long time. You see, the Carter family wasn't the first." My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea what she meant, but I felt the unease creeping up my spine as she continued. "Years ago, back in the 1920s, a similar thing happened. The Bellamy family, father, mother, 2 children, died in their beds, just like the Carters. No marks on their bodies, no sign of struggle, but their faces, oh, their faces were something else. Their eyes were wide open, but their mouths were twisted in fear. People said they looked like they'd seen something that terrified them beyond words. I could feel the air around me grow heavier as Mrs. Caldwell spoke. Her hands, knotted with age, shook as she continued. Years ago, back in the 1920s, a similar thing happened. The Bellamy family, father, mother, 2 children, died in their beds, just like the Carters. No marks on their bodies, no sign of struggle, but their faces, oh, their faces were something else. Their eyes were wide open, but their mouths were twisted in fear. People said they looked like they'd seen something that terrified them beyond words. I could feel the air around me grow heavier as Mrs. Caldwell spoke. Her hands, knotted with age, shook as she continued. After the Bellamys, other families started dying too. In the same way, each one in their own home, each one with that same fear in their eyes. No one knew what to make of it. No one could explain it. And then, one by one, people just stopped talking about it. They'd gotten too afraid to ask questions. People said that whoever looked into it too deeply would be marked by the same fate. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "The Carter family," Mrs. Caldwell continued, her voice lowering to a whisper. "They lived in the same house as the Bellamys. That house, you see, has been the site of every one of these mysterious deaths. And there's something else about that house, something no one wants to say out loud. People believe it's cursed, that the house itself is alive. And once it decides to claim someone, it doesn't stop until it's taken everyone." The chill that ran through me was unlike anything I had ever felt. I tried to brush off the feeling, thinking that Mrs. Caldwell was just an old woman with an overactive imagination. But there was something in her eyes, a deep, unshakable fear, that told me she wasn't lying. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of the Carter family, the Bellamys, and the strange deaths that had haunted this town for so long. I couldn't understand why people hadn't left, why they had allowed this curse to linger. But then I thought about my father and his reaction when I asked about the deaths. Maybe it wasn't just the town that was hiding something. Maybe it was him too. The next morning, I asked my father again about the Carter family. This time, he didn't brush me off. Instead, he stood silent for a long moment before speaking. "Son, listen to me," he said, his voice low and strained. I didn't want you to know this, but there's no way to stop it now. The Carter family, they were the last victims. The thing that haunts this town, that kills in silence, isn't a person or a ghost. It's something older, something no one can fight. It's been here for generations, and it won't stop until everyone in Maple Creek is gone. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What is it? What's causing these deaths? My father looked at me, his eyes full of regret. It's the land itself. This town, this place, it's cursed. There's something in these hills, something that feeds on fear, and once it senses that you're afraid, it won't let you go. The Carter family, they should have never moved into that house. But now it's too late. You've been marked. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but the fear in my father's eyes told me he wasn't joking. Maple Creek, a town so picturesque and peaceful on the outside, was hiding a terrifying secret, one that no one could escape. That night, I made my way to the Carter house. It was late, and the town was quiet. I had to see for myself what had happened there, what had caused so many deaths. As I walked down the empty street toward the house, I could feel the air grow cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The house loomed before me, dark and silent, but I could sense something watching me. I stepped closer to the house and peered through the broken windows. The interior was dark and dusty, and I could see the faint outline of furniture, abandoned long ago. The place was unsettlingly still, but as I stood there, something shifted in the air. A whisper, a soft, almost inaudible whisper, sounded from within the house. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was too distant, too otherworldly. I didn't want to go inside, but something compelled me to take a step forward. And then, the door creaked open by itself. Before I could turn and run, I felt something, cold fingers brushing against my shoulder, pulling me into the house. The door slammed shut behind me. The whispers grew louder. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift and move. The coldness in the air thickened. And then, in the silence, I heard it, a voice that wasn't mine. Welcome to Maple Creek, where the dead never leave. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang, and I knew then that the curse had finally claimed me too. Crow Hollow was a small town, isolated on the outskirts of nowhere. It sat nestled deep within a dense forest, where the mist hung in the trees like a veil, and the silence was only ever broken by the occasional call of a distant bird or the creak of old branches swaying in the wind. Growing up in the city, I had never imagined that such a quiet place could exist. But when my parents announced we were moving there, I was too young to understand what lay beneath the town's sleepy exterior. We arrived in Crow Hollow in the middle of a gray autumn, the sky always a dull shade of overcast. The house we moved into was old, built in the early 1900s, with large windows that creaked in the wind and floors that groaned with every step. From the first night, something felt off about the place. It wasn't just the isolation, but the way the town seemed to cling to its past. No one spoke about the events that had taken place, but everyone knew about them. An unspoken understanding that hovered like a shadow. The first thing I noticed about Crow Hollow was its small size. The streets were empty most of the time, save for a few elderly people who wandered around, always watching you from the corners of their eyes. The houses, though well-kept, had a dull, lifeless quality to them, as if they were just waiting for something. People didn't speak much to newcomers. It was as if they had already decided who belonged and who didn't. But it wasn't until I started school that I began to hear the stories. It was my first day, and the kids at school were unusually quiet. It wasn't until lunch that I overheard some of the older kids talking about the curse of Crow Hollow. I didn't understand what they meant, so I asked one of my classmates, a girl named Rachel, what it was about. "Don't ask about it," she whispered urgently. "It's bad luck. Just don't go looking for answers." I pressed her for more, but she shut down, her face going pale as she looked around nervously. It wasn't until a few days later that I learned what she was talking about, the mysterious deaths that had plagued the town for decades. The first death had occurred in the 1920s, when a young woman named Helen Stark disappeared without a trace. Her body was never found, but there were rumors that her ghost still wandered the forest surrounding Crow Hollow, looking for someone to take her place. Over the years, Other strange deaths occurred. People would vanish without warning, and their bodies were found days later, miles away from where they had last been seen, with their eyes wide open, their faces frozen in fear. No one could explain it, and the townspeople refused to talk about it. Just be careful around the forest. My mom told me one night after I asked her about the deaths. People say there's something out there, something that watches you. It takes whoever it wants. The more I learned, the more I realized that the people in Crow Hollow weren't just afraid of the past. They were terrified of it. And it wasn't until one night that I finally began to understand why. It started with the whispers. It was late in the evening when I first heard them. Faint murmurs, as if someone was speaking just outside my window. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, but the wind howled through the trees, and the sound of branches scraping against the glass was unsettling. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The whispers grew louder, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. No one. But that night, the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, and I began to hear them even in the daylight. At school, while walking home, as I sat in my room doing homework, faint voices, speaking in an unintelligible language, would echo in my ears. It felt like I was being watched, always. I started to avoid the woods, though I couldn't explain why. It was as if something was pulling me there, like an invisible hand urging me into the darkness. My parents noticed that I was growing more and more anxious, but they assumed it was just the stress of adjusting to a new life. But it wasn't just that. One evening, after a long day at school, I decided to take a walk around the town to clear my head. The mist was thick, curling up from the ground like fingers reaching for the sky. As I wandered, I passed the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. I had been there a few times, but something about it felt different tonight. The air was colder, and the ground beneath my feet felt unusually soft, as if something was moving beneath it. As I walked further into the cemetery, I noticed that the tombstones were older than I had thought. Some of the names were barely legible, worn away by time and the elements. But as I walked past one of the gravestones, I saw something strange, a shadow. It flickered in and out of view, just at the edge of my vision. I turned around, but there was nothing there. No one. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold, creeping dread crawl up my spine. But then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from somewhere deep in the cemetery. "Help me." The voice was faint, but it was there, and it sent a shiver through my entire body. I took a step back, my feet moving on their own as I stumbled toward the exit. The whispering grew louder as I ran, until it was all around me, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. I made it back to the safety of my house, my heart racing. That night, I locked all the windows and doors, and even though I knew it was silly, I pulled the blankets up to my chin and tried to sleep. But the next morning, something had changed. I woke up to the sound of knocking at the door. My dad was already at work, so I opened the door, expecting to see one of the neighbors. Instead, standing in front of me was a tall man, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He wore an old, weathered coat, and his hands were gloved, even though the weather was warm. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man said nothing. He simply held out a small, tattered envelope. I took it from him, and before I could ask who he was or what he wanted, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with only a few words written on it. "The Watchers are waiting. Don't look for them." My hands trembled as I read the note again and again. It didn't make sense, but the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that the man, the Watcher, wasn't just a stranger. He was part of something bigger. The town had warned me, but I hadn't listened. Now, I was part of it too. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I tossed and turned, my thoughts swirling in confusion and fear. At one point, I thought I saw something outside my window, just the faintest shadow in the mist. But when I blinked, it was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. The whispers came again, but this time, they weren't faint. They were clearer, closer, and they were calling my name. I knew then that Crow Hollow was not just a town. It was a trap, a place that lured people in, made them feel safe, and then slowly took everything from them. I wasn't sure who or what the watchers were, but I could feel their eyes on me, from the trees, from the cemetery, from the house next door. The next day, I tried to tell my parents what had been happening, but when I mentioned the whispers and the man who had come to my door, they only looked at me with a strange, distant expression. They told me it was just my imagination, that I needed to relax and stop worrying. But I knew better. That night, as the mist crept in, I heard the whispers again, louder than ever. And this time, they weren't just in my head. They were outside my window, scratching against the glass, begging me to look. I could feel the presence of something just beyond the shadows. I wanted to scream, but the words never came. And then, as the mist swallowed the town whole, I understood. Crow Hollow had taken me, just like it had taken so many others before me. The Watchers had been waiting all along, and now I was theirs. The last thing I remember is the cold, the mist, and the soft whispering in the wind. You'll never leave. Hollow Pines, a small town nestled in the shadow of the Everwood Forest, was as quiet as it was ancient. Most people wouldn't even know it existed unless they had a specific reason to pass through. It wasn't on the map, nor was it advertised to tourists. To anyone who had never heard of it, it was just a patch of trees and winding roads. But for those who had grown up there, it was home. I wasn't from Hollow Pines, but when my parents decided to move there, I learned quickly that the town held more secrets than most people could imagine. It was the summer of my senior year when we packed up and moved to Hollow Pines. My father had accepted a job as the new town historian, a role that was both respected and oddly mysterious. He told me that the position would allow him to work from home and finally take a break from the city life. But there was something about the job that seemed to pull him in, something beyond the appeal of quiet country living. The town itself was picturesque, with its cobblestone streets, charming little shops, and century-old buildings. But there was a strange unease that settled over Hollow Pines, an oppressive quietness that seemed to cling to the town like the fog that hung in the morning air. Even the people who lived there seemed different, polite, but distant. They would smile at you and offer greetings, but it was clear they didn't want to get too close. It wasn't until later that I realized they had a reason for their distance. I had heard rumors about the town's past even before we arrived. There were whispers about a road on the outskirts of town, a place that was rarely talked about, the forgotten road of Hollow Pines. People said that the road was cursed, that strange things happened to anyone who ventured down it. But, of course, I dismissed these stories as the typical small-town superstition. That is, until I found myself drawn to it. One evening, after we had settled in and I was beginning to make friends at the local high school, I was out walking when I came across the road. It wasn't marked on any of the maps my father had shown us, but there it was, just beyond the woods. The path was narrow, winding, and overgrown with tall grass. The trees that lined it seemed to tower over it, their branches twisted in strange, unnatural shapes. The air around it felt colder, like the temperature dropped by several degrees as soon as I stepped onto the road. As I stood there, staring down the forgotten path, I felt a pull, a strange sensation that urged me to take the first step forward. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the curiosity gnawed at me. Something about the place felt different. The very air seemed to hum with an eerie energy, and the longer I stood there, the more I could feel a sense of something watching me. Against my better judgment, I took a deep breath and began walking down the road. The further I went, the darker it became, even though it was still early in the evening. The trees closed in around me, casting long shadows that seemed to move with me. The only sound was the crunch of my boots against the gravel road and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. As I walked, I began to notice something unsettling. The road, though abandoned, was littered with remnants of the past. Old, broken lanterns that still had faint traces of dried wax inside them, torn scraps of paper fluttering in the breeze, and faded signs that had long since lost their meaning. The path seemed to stretch on forever, and just when I thought I might turn back, I heard something, footsteps. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was following me, but when I spun around, I saw no one. The road behind me was as empty as it had been when I first started walking. Get a grip, I muttered to myself, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. I turned and continued walking, but the footsteps resumed, closer now. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the air around me grew thick with an oppressive weight. Just as I was about to turn and leave, I saw it, a shadow, just at the edge of my vision. It was fleeting, but I could swear I saw a figure standing in the distance. It was tall, unmoving, and it seemed to be watching me. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze burning into me. Before I could react, the figure vanished, swallowed by the darkness of the woods. My legs shook, and I turned to run, the sound of footsteps still echoing behind me. As I sprinted down the road, my heart raced, and I could hear the footsteps growing louder, like someone, or something, was closing in. I didn't stop running until I reached the end of the road. When I finally stumbled out of the trees and back into the familiar streets of Hollow Pines, I turned around and found that the road had disappeared. The overgrown path was gone, and all I could see was the dense forest. I took a few moments to catch my breath and steady myself before making my way home. That night, I locked every window and door in the house and stayed awake, listening for any sign of something following me. But the house was silent, and I eventually fell into an uneasy sleep. The next day, I mentioned the road to my parents, but neither of them seemed surprised. My father, in particular, looked at me with a strange expression. "That road is old," he said quietly, his gaze distant. "It's been there for as long as the town has, but people around here don't go near it for a reason. It's been the site of strange disappearances over the years. People say the road calls to them, and once you walk it, you're never the same again." I was taken aback. "Disappearances? What do you mean?" He shook his head, his face grim. "There are stories. People have vanished over the years. Strangers, locals. Some of them were found, but many were never seen again. The town doesn't talk about it much, but I've seen the records. No one knows what happens to them, but they always go down that road. And once they're gone, the road vanishes as if it never existed." I couldn't believe it. "So, what's going on with it? What happens to them?" My father looked at me, his face pale. "That's something you shouldn't be asking about, son. Some things are better left forgotten." But I couldn't forget. I couldn't shake the feeling that the road had somehow chosen me, and it wanted me to return. The idea of it haunted me, and I couldn't ignore the pull it had on me. A few days later, I decided I had to go back. I needed answers, even if it meant confronting whatever was hiding out there. As night fell, I grabbed a flashlight, slipped out of the house, and made my way to the edge of town. The air felt heavy, and the fog was thicker than it had been before. This time, the road was waiting for me, as if it had been there all along, just waiting for me to return. I stepped onto the forgotten road of Hollow Pines, and the chill from before settled around me like a cloak. The trees loomed, dark and twisted, and the path ahead seemed endless, stretching into the night. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, but this time, I didn't stop. I walked forward, determined to reach the end, to find out the truth. The whispers started, low at first, then growing louder. "Turn back," they said. "You'll never leave." But I didn't turn back. I couldn't. The road had me in its grip. I kept walking until I saw it. An old house, abandoned and decaying, standing at the end of the road. It was shrouded in mist, and the windows were dark, as if no one had lived there for years. But as I approached, the door creaked open, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. I stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. The walls were covered in faded portraits, people I didn't recognize, their eyes staring out at me from the past. I wandered through the house, my heartbeat echoing in my ears, until I found a small room at the back. There, lying in the center of the room, was a large, dusty mirror. The moment I looked into it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A reflection of myself, but with dark, hollow eyes and a twisted smile. I gasped and took a step back, but the reflection didn't move. And then I understood. The road wasn't just a place, it was a trap. A place where the lost souls of Hollow Pines were bound, cursed to wander forever. The people who had disappeared had been claimed by the road, and now, I too had become one of them. The last thing I remember is the door slamming shut behind me, and the whispers growing louder, filling the room until there was nothing left but darkness. No one saw me again after that night. The forgotten road of Hollow Pines claimed me, just like it had claimed so many before me. And as the town moved on, no one ever spoke of the road again. It had been forgotten until the next soul wandered down its path. Greystone Hollow was a town that didn't appear on any modern map, and it had the kind of atmosphere you'd expect from a place forgotten by time. When my family moved there, I was just a kid, eager to explore the countryside. It was a quiet place, nestled between towering, dark mountains. The kind of town where everything felt like it belonged to another era. Old brick houses, crooked streets, and a bell tower that loomed over the town like a sentinel, watching, always watching. I was told the town had only a few hundred people living there, many of whom had lived their entire lives in the same houses. There were a few scattered shops and a small school, but the town's most distinctive feature was the bell tower, which stood in the center of Greystone Hollow, the bells inside never ringing except for special occasions. But despite the quiet, there was an undercurrent of unease that seemed to flow through the town, especially at night. I first heard the stories about the cursed bells when I was exploring with my new friend, Nathan. Nathan was one of the only kids around my age, and he quickly became my closest companion. He was quiet, with dark eyes that always seemed to be thinking, and an unsettling way of staring off into space, as though he could see something no one else could. One evening, we were sitting on the steps of an old house near the town square when he told me about the bells. "Do you know about the bells in the tower?" Nathan asked, his voice low and cautious. I shook my head. "What about them?" Nathan looked around, then leaned in close, his face pale in the fading light. "They say the bells are cursed. They only ring when someone's about to die." I laughed, thinking it was some kind of sick joke. "That sounds crazy. Bells don't ring for that kind of thing." Nathan's eyes darkened. I thought the same thing, but my grandma, she told me stories about the bells. People used to hear them ringing in the night, but it wasn't like a regular bell. It would sound like someone was pulling on the ropes, but nobody would ever be there. It was always followed by a death. I frowned, uncertain. "So what? The bells are like a warning?" Nathan nodded. "Something like that. My grandma says the bells were cursed a long time ago, when the town was founded. There's a history to it, a terrible one. People used to go missing, and then the bells would ring." At this point, my curiosity was piqued. I wasn't one to believe in superstitions, but the way Nathan spoke made it hard to brush off. There was something in his tone, something too serious for a town legend. I asked him more, but he quickly became evasive, muttering something about not wanting to get involved. The next few days were uneventful. My family got settled, and I started attending the local high school, but I couldn't shake Nathan's story about the bells. That night, after everyone went to bed, I decided to sneak out and visit the bell tower to see if there was any truth to the legend. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the town as I made my way through the streets. The bell tower stood tall and imposing at the end of the square, the dark silhouette of its spire rising against the night sky. I walked toward it, the sound of my footsteps the only noise in the stillness. The door to the tower was slightly ajar, as though inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. I could barely make out the stairs that spiraled up into the darkness, but I took a deep breath and started to climb. Each step creaked under my weight, echoing through the empty tower. As I ascended, I noticed something strange. The temperature seemed to drop the higher I went, as though I was moving through layers of time. When I finally reached the top, I was met with a vast room filled with old ropes and mechanisms, all connected to the enormous bells above. The bells were silent, still. The ropes that once rang them were coiled neatly and used. But there was something about the room that felt wrong, like the bells were waiting for something, for someone. Just as I was about to turn to leave, a sound broke the silence. A low, muffled thud, followed by the unmistakable creak of a rope being pulled. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I turned around, but the room was empty. The bells hung motionless above me. I quickly made my way back down the stairs, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind racing. When I reached the ground floor, I could hear voices. Panic surged through me, and I ran out into the night, back to my house. I never went back to the bell tower after that night, but the strange feeling lingered. The feeling that something was watching, something waiting. The next week, the first death occurred. It was old Mrs. Harper, who lived in a small cottage at the edge of town. She had been a kind woman, with white hair and a gentle smile. But one morning, she was found dead in her home, her body pale and lifeless, her eyes wide open, as if frozen in fear. No one knew what happened. There were no signs of foul play, no explanation. The townspeople were devastated, but I couldn't help but notice the odd silence that followed the news. No one spoke about it directly, but everyone seemed to avoid the bell tower. The next day, I overheard some of the older residents talking in hushed voices about the curse. They mentioned how the bells had rung the night before, and how every death in Greystone Hollow was always preceded by the ringing of those bells. And then it happened again. A week after Mrs. Harper's death, another resident of the town, Mr. Fletcher, was found dead in his home. He was a quiet man, always keeping to himself, but his death was just as mysterious as Mrs. Harper's. The bells rang that night, just as they had for her. The pattern was unmistakable. Every time someone died in Greystone Hollow, the bells would toll, and the death would be followed by whispers of the curse. It wasn't long before the entire town was on edge. People began to avoid the bell tower altogether, and some even moved away, unable to bear the fear that clung to the place. But the deaths didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to accelerate. One by one, the townspeople began to die under mysterious circumstances, each death accompanied by the sound of the bells ringing in the night. It wasn't long before there was talk of a hidden force, something that had been awakened long ago when the town was founded. Whispers of a deal with the devil, made in exchange for prosperity, a deal sealed by the cursed bells, which would toll every time the price had to be paid. I couldn't shake the thought that the bells were more than just a warning. They were part of something darker, something ancient. The curse wasn't just about death, it was about payment. The town of Greystone Hollow had made its deal, and now it was paying the price. In the weeks that followed, more deaths came, each one more chilling than the last. The townspeople became increasingly paranoid, locking their doors at night, refusing to speak of the bell tower. But no matter how hard they tried, the bells continued to toll, echoing through the night, reminding everyone that death was never far away. Then, one cold evening, Nathan disappeared. It was late when I got the news. His parents had searched the house and the town, but there was no sign of him. They thought he had gone into the woods, or perhaps down to the river, but as the hours passed, it became clear that something was wrong. By morning, the search parties had grown desperate, but it wasn't until the third day that Nathan's body was found. His eyes were wide open, his expression frozen in terror, and the bells had rung that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow next, that the curse had followed me from the moment I had stepped into the bell tower. And so, as I sat in my room, listening to the wind howl through the streets of Greystone Hollow, I made a decision. I couldn't leave. No one could leave. The curse of the bells had claimed us all, and now, it was only a matter of time before the toll came for me. The bells had already started to ring again, and this time, I knew they were calling for me. When my family first moved to the small town of Elm Creek, I was eager to leave behind the hustle and bustle of the city. My parents were seeking a quieter life, a place where they could both work from home and I could experience the kind of idyllic small-town life I'd read about in books. Elm Creek seemed perfect, nestled in the valley of a secluded mountain range, surrounded by dense forests and fields that stretched for miles. It had all the charm of an old-fashioned community. At first, everything felt peaceful. The air was crisp, the streets were empty, and the only sounds were the chirps of crickets at night and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. We settled into a small house on the outskirts of town, right at the foot of a steep hill known as Widow's Hill. The locals had warned us about it, of course. Stay away from Widow's Hill, especially after dark. One of our neighbors, Mrs. Lawson, had told me with a glance over her shoulder, as if afraid someone might be listening. That place has seen more than its share of strange things. Don't say I didn't warn you. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. Widow's Hill looked like any other hill, just a slope covered with trees and wildflowers, stretching into the forest. But the townspeople were adamant. Everyone knew not to go near it. They didn't talk about it much, but the unspoken rule was clear: stay away. One evening, a few weeks after we moved in, I decided to venture up the hill. I had grown curious about the rumors and wanted to see for myself what made it so ominous. The sun was setting as I began the hike, the cool evening air filling my lungs. It was a beautiful sight, with the town spread out below and the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. But as I climbed higher, I felt a creeping unease settle in. The higher I went, the quieter it became. The trees around me grew denser, and the sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy. There was a strange stillness in the air, a silence that made my skin prickle. It felt like the entire hill was holding its breath. I pressed on, determined to reach the top, where I had heard there was an old, abandoned cabin. When I reached the peak, I found it just as the locals had described: a crumbling wooden cabin, long forgotten and overtaken by the encroaching forest. The windows were broken, the door hanging on a single hinge. The air around it was thick with decay, and the ground was littered with old, rusted tools and bits of broken furniture. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The smell of mold and rotting wood filled my nostrils. I looked around the room, trying to make sense of the place, when something caught my eye. In the far corner, covered in dust and cobwebs, was an old, tarnished mirror. I walked toward it, wiping away the grime from the surface. When my reflection appeared in the glass, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, standing just behind me in the mirror, was a figure. A woman dressed in a tattered black dress, her face obscured by shadows. She was pale, almost ghostly, and her hair was long and tangled, falling over her shoulders like a veil. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My breath quickened as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, her eyes now visible, dark, empty eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The temperature in the room had dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. "Help me." The voice was barely audible, but it chilled me to my core. I didn't stay to investigate. I ran out of the cabin, not looking back until I reached the bottom of the hill, where I collapsed, gasping for breath. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face, her hollow eyes staring at me from the mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me. The image haunted me for days, and I couldn't stop thinking about the strange whisper I had heard. The next morning, I decided to ask Mrs. Lawson about it. She had been in the town long enough to know the history, and I hoped she could shed some light on the mystery of Widow's Hill. When I arrived at her house, she was sitting on the porch, knitting a scarf. I hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Mrs. Lawson," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "can you tell me about the woman on Widow's Hill? The one in the cabin?" She stopped knitting and looked at me with a grim expression. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the knitting down. "I thought you'd ask," she muttered, her voice low. "It's not a story people like to tell, but it's one that needs to be known." Mrs. Lawson's face darkened as she continued. "Years ago, the cabin on Widow's Hill belonged to a young woman named Margaret. She moved to Elm Creek with her husband, a man named John, who worked as a miner. They were in love, or at least it seemed that way. But after a few years, strange things started happening in the town. Miners began disappearing, and people said they saw shadows in the woods at night. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. Some said John had gone mad. Others claimed he was part of a cult that had been performing strange rituals in the woods. One evening, Margaret disappeared. Her husband said she had gone for a walk up the hill, but she never came back. For weeks, they searched, but she was never found. Then, one day, her body was discovered, buried at the foot of the hill near the cabin. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. But what happened to her? How did she die? I asked. Mrs. Lawson shook her head. No one knows. There were no signs of struggle. Some say she was murdered by her husband. Others claim she died from some sort of curse. The strange thing was, after her death, John disappeared too. No one ever saw him again. People believe he either ran away or... Her voice trailed off as she glanced at me, as if to confirm I understood the unspoken conclusion, or that he met the same fate as his wife. The silence between us was thick. I felt the weight of her words pressing down on me, and for a moment, I thought I could still hear that whisper. "Help me? You said the bells tolled," I said, trying to change the subject. "What do they mean?" Mrs. Lawson's eyes grew distant. "The bells," she said slowly, "ring whenever someone dies in Elm Creek. It's been that way for generations. People don't talk about it much, but they say the bells toll when the curse claims another life. Margaret's death was the first, but it hasn't stopped since. The bells toll at least once a year, sometimes more, and each time, someone else dies." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "And the woman in the mirror?" I asked. "Is she still there?" Mrs. Lawson nodded gravely. "Margaret's spirit never left. She's trapped on Widow's Hill, waiting for someone to listen, someone to help her. She won't let anyone go up there without leaving a piece of themselves behind." That afternoon, I decided I needed to go back. I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's spirit was trying to reach out to me. The bells had tolled again that night, and I was certain the curse was drawing closer. When I arrived at the cabin on Widow's Hill, the sun was setting. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. I felt Margaret's presence before I even reached the door. As I stepped inside, I saw the mirror again. This time, it was clearer. Margaret stood there, her dark eyes staring at me, pleading. "Help me," she whispered again. I reached out to touch the mirror, but the moment my fingers brushed the surface, the temperature dropped. The ground beneath me trembled, and the mirror cracked, splintering into 1,000 pieces. And then, I heard it, the tolling of the bells. The sound echoed through the valley, growing louder and louder, until it felt as though the whole town was being consumed by the sound. I knew then that Margaret's curse had finally claimed me. As the darkness closed in, I realized I would never leave Widow's Hill. The bells had tolled for me, and now, I would be part of the curse too, forever lost among the echoes of Elm Creek's tragic past.